The coil cat stopped moving 11 seconds after Naomi Calder walked into its enclosure, and it did not move again for the rest of the test. That was the part nobody had briefed her on. She had expected a snarl, a bluff charge, something with teeth in it. Instead, the animal simply froze mid-stride, one clawed foot lifted off the warm stone, its long spotted body gone rigid the way a rope goes rigid right before it snaps taut. Its pupils, vertical slits the width of her thumb, widened until the amber around them nearly vanished. Then, very slowly, as if some internal alarm had overridden every instinct that had made it the apex hunter of an entire jungle continent, the coil cat lowered itself to the ground, flattened its ears, and looked away from her. Not at her feet. Not at her hands, empty and open at her sides. At the floor in front of her, the way a dog looks away from an owner it has already decided not to test. Naomi stood very still in the middle of the enclosure, unarmed, in a gray field jacket with the Coalition Ethology Directorate patch stitched crooked on the shoulder because she'd sewn it on herself the night before. And she thought, with the calm, faintly embarrassed clarity of someone watching a smoke alarm go off over a slice of burnt toast, well, that's not supposed to happen. Behind the reinforced glass, in the observation gallery, 11 researchers of 4 different species stopped breathing at roughly the same moment. Director Ilvex Marn of the Coalition Ethology Directorate did not stop breathing. Exactly. Charon didn't breathe the way soft-bodied species did, air moving through slotted spiracles along the plates of her thorax in a rhythm she'd long since stopped noticing. But every one of those spiracles clicked shut at once, a small dry sound like a row of doors closing down a corridor, and for 3 full seconds the reading on the vocal amplifier in front of her showed nothing but silence. "Run it again," she said finally. "Director, run the baseline capture again. I want confirmation the feed isn't compressed, dropped, or spoofed. I want the raw sensor log, not the processed overlay." Marn's mandibles clicked twice, a habit of hers when a hypothesis she'd built her career on was in the process of dying in front of her. "Get Warden Kess in here. Now." On the enclosure floor, 12 meters below the gallery glass, the coil cat had gone belly flat against the warm stone, the posture Naomi had read 100 times in 100 different manuals about 100 different apex predators back on Earth. The posture of an animal that has already lost the fight before the fight has started, and knows it. She had come here to be the control subject in an unremarkable afternoon of baseline data collection. Instead, 11 seconds in, she had apparently ended one. 6 years earlier, humanity had not existed as far as the coalition of bound worlds was concerned. Not as a threat, not as an asset, not even as an entry in the endless catalog of species. The Directorate spent its considerable resources measuring, sorting, and filing into neat administrative drawers. Then a coalition survey vessel had clipped the edge of a human deep space relay array outside the orbit of a world called Kesh, and the slow, cautious, deeply bureaucratic process of first contact had begun, and 6 years later humanity had been folded into the coalition's outer administrative tier, the way a new employee gets folded into a company org chart, quietly near the bottom, mostly ignored. Which was, as far as Naomi Calder was concerned, exactly how she liked it. She had not come to Meridian Threshold Station to make history. She had come because the Coalition Ethology Directorate needed a human baseline subject for its predator threat calibration catalog, the massive standing index that told colonial administrators, zoo curators, and frontier settlement boards which species could be safely housed near which other species. And because the posting paid better in 6 months than 4 years running the cat sanctuary back in the hill country outside Nairobi ever had, and because, if she was honest with herself, which she tried to be, at least in the mornings before coffee, she had wanted to see what a genuinely alien apex predator looked like up close, the way some people wanted to see the ocean floor or the inside of a volcano. She had not expected to be the volcano. "Ms. Calder," The voice came through the small comm bead tucked behind her ear, translated a half-second late into the flat, careful Coalition Standard dialect that always sounded to her like someone reading aloud from a report. It was Marn. "Please hold your position. Do not approach the specimen." "I wasn't planning to," Naomi said. "It doesn't seem to want company." "Confirm you are uninjured." "I'm fine, bit warm. Is the door locking mechanism still functional? Because if it isn't, I'd like someone to fix that before the next one." There was a pause on the line long enough that she could hear, faintly, several overlapping voices arguing in the gallery above her. The flat translated cadence of Coalition Standard tangled up with what sounded like at least two other native tongues, sharp and clipped. The kind of argument that happens when a room full of experts realizes the thing they were all certain about an hour ago is no longer true. "The door is functional," Marn said. "Please remain calm." "I am calm," Naomi said, and meant it, and did not think to mention that the coilcat currently pressed flat against the warm stone 8 meters from her, refusing to even lift its head, was the calmest thing in the room by a wide margin. The enclosure had been built to hold something considerably more dangerous than one unarmed human. 12 meters of reinforced transparent alloy ringed a floor of warmed volcanic stone terraced with climbing structures the coilcat species favored in the wild, a jungle canopy simulation, expensive, purpose-built, the kind of habitat the Directorate maintained for exactly one reason: to study, in careful and repeatable conditions, how apex predator species from 100 different worlds reacted to novel stimuli, new colony species, new industrial equipment, new sounds, new smells, new silhouettes moving through their territory. The Directorate's threat calibration catalog was, in a very real sense, the reason interstellar colonization worked at all, the reason a farming settlement on some frontier moon didn't get founded 3 kilometers from an apex predator's breeding range without anyone knowing it, the reason a zoo could house 2 species from opposite ends of the galaxy in adjacent enclosures, without one of them going through the wall at the other out of pure hindbrain terror. Humanity, 6 years into its coalition membership, had a threat calibration entry that consisted, at present, of 4 lines of provisional data and a note flagged insufficient sample. Nobody had run the baseline test yet. Nobody had thought it urgent. Humans were, by every metric anyone had bothered to record, an unremarkable mid-tier omnivore species from an unremarkable garden world, notable mainly for an aggressive fondness for caffeinated beverages and an unusually high tolerance for pain during minor medical procedures. The kind of species you got around to cataloging eventually, once the more interesting entries were finished. Naomi had volunteered for the baseline run 3 weeks ago over a lunch she barely remembered, mostly because Director Marn had asked in the tone of someone requesting a minor favor. "Stand in a room. Let us measure the animal's reaction. Go home." And Naomi had spent enough of her life around large predatory cats to find the prospect more interesting than intimidating. She had signed 4 consent forms, sat through 2 hours of safety orientation delivered by a Tulkari handler with tusks the length of her forearm, and been assured, repeatedly, that the enclosure's containment field would engage in under a second if the specimen showed any sign of approaching her. The field had never engaged. There had been nothing to contain. Above her, the gallery door hissed open, and a new voice entered the comm feed, lower, rougher, translated with a lag that suggested the speaker's native cadence didn't map cleanly onto Coalition Standard grammar. "Warden Oyokes." Naomi had met him twice, once during orientation, where he'd barely spoken, and once in the station commissary, where he'd sat alone at the end of a long table eating something that steamed and smelled faintly of scorched sugar, and had nodded at her the way one professional nods at another across a crowded room. "Ms. Calder." Kess's voice had a gravel undertone the translation software couldn't quite smooth out. "Turn your head slowly toward the enclosure's east wall. Do not make direct eye contact, with the specimen when you do it. Why? Because I want to see something, and I would rather you not get bitten proving me right. Naomi turned her head slowly toward the east wall, keeping her shoulders angled the way she'd been trained a lifetime ago not to square them at a nervous animal. 8 meters away, still flattened against the warm stone, the coalcat's ears swiveled, tracking her. She realized not her face, not her hands. Her spine. The long, low center line of her body, the way a hunting animal tracks the part of another animal that tells it, in half a heartbeat, how fast that animal could turn and close the distance. "It's still watching me," she said. "Yes," Kes said. There was something in his voice she couldn't place yet, something that would take her another 4 hours and 3 more enclosures to learn to recognize as the sound of a professional watching every assumption he'd built his career on come apart in real time. It has been for the last 90 seconds. It has not looked away once. Is that unusual? A pause. "Ms. Calder," Kes said, "that animal has never held eye contact with anything for more than 4 seconds in its entire recorded life, including its own reflection." They pulled her out through the service airlock 9 minutes later, once the coilcat had been coaxed, gently, with considerable patience from 2 Tulkari handlers, and a tray of raw meat it did not touch, into a transfer crate on the far side of the enclosure. It went without resistance. It went, Naomi thought, the way something goes when it has already decided that resistance is a category of behavior no longer available to it. The debrief room smelled like ozone and cold metal, the particular chill of a space kept several degrees below what any of its human occupants found comfortable, because most of the station's staff ran warmer than humans did, and the environmental system split the difference in the directorate's favor. Naomi sat on the edge of a bench designed for something with a different pelvis than hers, accepted a cup of the bitter dark tea the commissary served in place of coffee, and watched 6 alien scientists argue in 3 overlapping languages about whether the sensor array had a calibration fault. "It's not the array," said a voice from the doorway, flat and tired in a way that made Naomi look up. "I checked it twice before she went in. I'll check it again if you want, but it's not the array." Ambassador Grady Voss was 63 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who had spent 30 years behind a desk after 20 years doing something considerably more physical, and he had been humanity's senior liaison to the Coalition Ethology Directorate for the better part of 2 years. A posting he privately considered a demotion from his previous work negotiating trade tariffs, and which he had come, slowly and against his own expectations, to find far more interesting than tariffs had ever been. He crossed the room, put a hand briefly on Naomi's shoulder in the absent, paternal way he'd been doing since she'd arrived on station 8 months ago fresh out of a very different kind of job, and looked at the 6 arguing scientists with the patient weariness of a man who had sat through this exact argument, in different forms, more times than he cared to count. "Nobody rigged your data," he said. "Nobody needed to. You all just watched something you've never seen before, and you're doing what everyone does when that happens, looking for the part that's broken, because the alternative is admitting the part that's broken is the model." Director Marn's mandibles clicked, slow and deliberate. "Ambassador Voss, with respect. We have run 411 baseline calibration tests on this specimen and its cousins over the past decade. We understand this animal's threat response repertoire in more granular detail than we understand our own children's. A 4-second reflexive freeze followed by active flight, sometimes preceded by a bluff display if the specimen judges the intruder small enough to challenge. That is the repertoire. There is no entry in that repertoire for what we just recorded. 11 seconds of total behavioral arrest. 90 seconds of sustained eye contact it has never once, in its life, sustained past 4. Full submissive posture toward a stimulus half its mass. No fangs, no claws, no visible weapon, no pheromonal threat marker we have equipment to detect. Her clustered eyes, 6 of them arranged in a shallow arc above her mandibles, turned toward Naomi with an expression that translated, across the considerable gulf between their two species, as something very close to bewilderment. The model is not broken, Ambassador. The model has simply never encountered this before. Encountered what? Naomi said. Me. Your species, Marn said. Possibly. I would prefer not to speculate further with a sample size of 1. Then run it again, Naomi said, and was faintly surprised at how easily the words came out, how little of the strange electric hour behind her had settled into anything she'd call fear. Mostly what she felt was the specific, focused curiosity that had gotten her into wildlife work in the first place, the same feeling she used to get crouched at the edge of the sanctuary's big cage at dawn, watching an old lioness named Kestrel decide, every single morning, whether that particular human was worth the energy of caring about. You've got a whole catalog to fill. I signed up for a baseline run, not one data point. Give me the next one. Marn's spiracles clicked shut, then open again, the Charon equivalent Naomi had learned of a long exhale. That, Marn said, is precisely what I intended to propose. The second enclosure was smaller, darker, built low and wide rather than tall, its floor a lattice of packed reddish soil riddled with tunnel mouths the width of a large barrel. The species catalogued within it. The directorate's briefing packet informed her in clipped clinical prose while she waited outside the airlock, was a Dreveki tunneler, an armored subterranean apex predator native to a heavy-gravity World 3 systems from the Coalition's administrative core, distinguished by a fused carapace capable of shrugging off small arms fire, and a bite force that had, on 4 separate recorded occasions, sheared through reinforced containment mesh, rated for considerably tougher animals. This one doesn't rely on sight, Kess told her through the comm bead, his voice carrying that same undertone from before, the one she still couldn't quite name. It's nearly blind. It hunts on vibration and heat signature. If your species truly does carry some marker the coilcat picked up on visually, this specimen won't have access to it. This is a cleaner test. You think the coilcat saw something, Naomi said. I think, Kess said, that I don't know what the coilcat did, and I have spent 19 years handling that species. I would like to know whether the next animal does the same thing for a completely different reason, or doesn't do it at all. The airlock cycled. Naomi stepped onto the packed red soil, warm and slightly damp underfoot, and the door sealed behind her with a soft, pressurized sigh. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. She stood in the center of the lattice of tunnel mouths, arms loose at her sides, and watched the reinforced glass of the gallery reflect the low amber lighting the directorate used for species that favored dim environments, and thought, with the small private amusement of someone whose expectations had already been thoroughly rearranged once today, that maybe this one really would be different. Maybe the coilcat really had been a fluke, some quirk of that particular animal's individual temperament, and the tunneler would simply do what the briefing packet said tunnelers did: approach cautiously, investigate by vibration, lose interest, retreat to feed on the meat the handlers had left near the tunnel mouths. Then the soil, directly in front of her, erupted. It happened fast enough that later, reviewing the footage, even Naomi would only really process it in 3 still frames, the ground breaking open in a spray of red dust, a shape the size of a large dog surging up and out of the earth with its jaws already unhinging to a width that looked, for one disorienting half-second, wide enough to take her whole shoulder. And then, mid-lunge, less than a meter from her, the animal simply stopping. Not slowing, stopping, as if it had run headlong into glass that wasn't there. The Dreveki hung frozen in the air for a fraction of a second longer than physics should have allowed, its armored bulk suspended mid-arc, jaws still half open, 4 stubby powerful legs still splayed in the launch position. And then it came down hard on its side in the red dust, scrabbled backward in a chaotic reversal that threw dirt in a wide fan across the enclosure floor, and did not stop retreating until it had crammed itself, bodily, back down the tunnel mouth it had erupted from, leaving only the pale, soft underside of its tail visible, twitching at the entrance. Naomi had not moved. She had not had time to move. She stood exactly where she'd been standing, pulse elevated but steady, and looked at the trembling tail disappearing by degrees into the tunnel, and said, mostly to herself, "Okay." In the gallery above, Warden Oyokes set down the tablet he'd been holding with a care that suggested his hands weren't entirely steady, and said nothing at all for 11 seconds. A silence that the station's automated transcript would later timestamp with unusual precision, because Director Marn had, by that point, begun requiring every word spoken in the observation gallery to be logged. "It's blind," Kess said finally, to no one in particular. "It cannot see her. It reacted to vibration and heat before it was close enough to smell her. It had already committed to the strike before it could have processed anything but her footsteps and her body heat, and it aborted a committed strike in open air, which I have never once seen this species do, not against a specimen twice her mass, not against an armed handler in a containment suit, not against anything." He looked up, and Naomi, watching through the reinforced glass, saw something on his broad, tusked face that she recognized without being able to name it in his language, the particular stillness of a man whose entire professional certainty had just quietly, irrevocably, come loose from its moorings. "Her footsteps," he said again, slower. "Something in the way she walks." By the time Naomi made it back to the debrief room, word had apparently traveled through Meridian Threshold Station, with the particular speed reserved for news that upends something everyone thought they understood. A dozen more staff had crowded into the observation gallery's outer corridor, and among them, arms crossed, mandibles set in the tight configuration Naomi had come to associate with barely restrained irritation, stood a Torvin official she didn't recognize, squat, plated in overlapping bands of a dull bronze carapace, wearing the layered formal wrap of the Coalition's Oversight Council rather than the Directorate's working uniform. "Counselor Bray Oswin," the official said, before Naomi had a chance to ask, in a voice that carried the flat, unhurried cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Oversight liaison for this quadrant's Colonial Safety Board. I've been reviewing your morning's footage, Ms. Calder, and I want to be direct with you. I don't believe it." "That's fair," Naomi said. "I'm not sure I believe it either. I don't mean I doubt what the sensors recorded. I mean I doubt what it implies." Oswin's small, deep-set eyes moved from Naomi to Marn, standing a few paces off with her spiracles still working in that slow, deliberate rhythm. "Director, 2 specimens is not calibration data. 2 specimens is an anecdote with excellent production values. If you intend to submit a revision to this species threat classification, and I understand from the gallery chatter that several of your staff are already using words like apex adjacent, which is, frankly, an alarming phrase to hear applied to a creature that stands 1.6 meters tall and appears to subsist largely on toasted bread, I will need considerably more than 2 enclosures and a great deal of nervous muttering." "What would you consider sufficient?" Marn said, in a tone Naomi was beginning to recognize as the Charon equivalent of gritted teeth. "A pack species," Oswin said promptly. "Coordinated predators are the harder case. A solitary ambush hunter or a blind tunneler reacting to some individual stimulus is one thing. Pack hunters coordinate through group signaling that overrides individual hesitation. That is, after all, the entire evolutionary point of hunting in a pack. If Ms. Calder's presence disrupts coordinated group behavior in a species bred across 40 generations specifically for pack hunting efficiency, then I will start taking this seriously. Until then, Director, I would remind you that the last time this directorate revised a threat classification on thin data, we spent 11 months and an embarrassing quantity of the Council's budget walking it back." Marn's mandibles clicked once sharp. "Warden Kess, the Skavineth enclosure, prep it." "Director, The Skavineth pack hasn't been exercised together in. I am aware of the exercise schedule, Warden. Prep it. Naomi, standing between them with her cooling cup of bitter tea still in hand, glanced at Ambassador Voss, who had come to stand at her shoulder sometime during Oswin's speech, and now wore the particular expression of a man doing complicated arithmetic behind a calm face. "You don't have to do this one," Voss said quietly in English, low enough that the translation bead wouldn't pick it up and render it for the room. "Two is already a story nobody's going to be able to sit on. You've made your point. Let them argue about it without you standing in a room full of animals whose whole job is figuring out how to kill things." "Grady," Naomi kept her voice equally low, equally even, "I ran a sanctuary for 4 years. I've had a lioness decide she liked me and a lioness decide she didn't, and both of those decisions happened in about the same 11 seconds it took that coilcat to hit the floor. I know what a predator backing off looks like. I don't know what's causing it here, and until I do, I'm not walking away from a data set that might actually explain it." She softened just slightly at the look on his face, the specific worry of a man twice her age who had, over 8 months, come to think of her with something between colleague and daughter, though neither of them had ever said so out loud. "I'm fine. Nothing's touched me yet. Nothing's come close to touching me." "That's what worries me," Voss said. "Not that something might hurt you. That nothing's even trying." The Skavineth enclosure was the largest habitat on the station, a broad artificial steppe under a domed simulated sky, dry grass the color of old rope rustling under a wind machine, calibrated to mimic the plains world the species called home. 6 animals moved into position along the enclosure's far ridge as the airlock behind Naomi sealed, lean, long-legged, built low through the shoulder and heavy through the jaw, moving with the loose, economical coordination of a unit that had hunted together long enough to stop needing to think about it. The lead animal, larger than the others by a clear margin, a ridge of darker fur running the length of its spine, paused at the top of the ridge and looked down at the single figure standing in the middle of the open grass. "That's Seer," Kess's voice said in her ear, quieter than before. "Pack Alpha, 11 years old, sired 4 litters, killed a rival challenger in single combat 2 seasons ago. If any animal on this station is going to override a stranger response with a hunting instinct, it's her." For a long moment, nothing moved but the dry grass and the wind machine's steady current. Then Seer came down off the ridge, not a charge, not yet, but the deliberate, stalking lope of a predator closing distance on a target it intended to take. And behind her the other 5 fanned out in the wide flanking pattern Naomi recognized from documentaries about wolves and painted dogs, and every other pack hunter Earth had ever produced, an encirclement forming with the smooth, wordless coordination of animals that had run this exact maneuver 1,000 times. Naomi did not run. Running, she knew from a decade of standing near animals considerably more dangerous than herself, was the single worst thing she could do, the one behavior guaranteed to convert a predator's hesitation into commitment. She stood, weight balanced, hands loose, and watched the pack close the circle around her with the particular stillness she had learned a long time ago and never quite unlearned. And somewhere in the calm center of her own mind, she registered distantly that her heart rate had not actually gone up very much at all. Seer reached the inner edge of the circle first, 8 meters out, and stopped. The animal behind her, closing the flank, stopped a half-second later, then the next. The whole coordinated encirclement, the product of 11 years of an apex predator's hard-earned killing experience and 4 decades of selective breeding for exactly this maneuver, simply came apart in real time, not into aggression, not into a bluff charge, but into 6 animals standing frozen at 8 meters, ears back, tails low, none of them looking directly at Naomi, all of them looking unmistakably at Seer. Waiting for a signal, their alpha had apparently stopped being capable of giving. Sear held Naomi's gaze for perhaps 4 seconds, longer than any of them had, longer than felt survivable to watch, in Naomi's private assessment, though she never let that assessment reach her face. And then the animal did something Naomi hadn't expected from a pack alpha with 4 litters and a kill to her name. She sat. Not lay down, not fled. Sat, haunches lowering onto the dry grass in the unmistakable posture of deference, ears flat, gaze dropped to the middle distance between herself and Naomi's boots, and one by one, in a ripple that moved down the line the way a shiver moves down a spine, the rest of the pack did the same. "She's not backing off," Kess said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the voice of a man narrating something he needed to say slowly in order to make himself believe it. "She's submitting, to a stranger, to a species she's never encountered that's given no threat display, no scent marker we can measure, nothing but—" He stopped, started again. "Ms. Calder, would you please very slowly take 3 steps backward?" Naomi did, and every animal on that dry, artificial step, 6 apex predators bred across 40 generations for the specific purpose of coordinated killing, tracked her retreat with lowered heads, and did not so much as twitch a muscle to follow. In the gallery, Counselor Bray Oswin had gone very still, the layered plates of his formal wrap motionless, his small deep-set eyes fixed on the enclosure floor with an expression that had traveled, somewhere in the last 90 seconds, from bureaucratic skepticism to something considerably harder to sit comfortably with. "I would like," he said finally, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier certainty, "to see the juvenile control." The juvenile control took 2 hours to arrange, and Naomi spent most of that time in the commissary picking at a plate of station-issue protein that tasted, as it always did, faintly of scorched sugar and nothing else, while Marn and Kess argued logistics in the corridor outside in voices pitched low enough that the translation bead only caught fragments. She gathered from what she overheard that the animal in question was a young Vashti coilcat, a cousin species to the first specimen, but crucially, a specimen raised from birth in complete isolation from any stimulus resembling a human. No footage, no scent samples, no exposure, direct or indirect, to any of the 4 lines of provisional data the Directorate had logged on humanity over 6 years. An animal that had never had the chance to learn, from any source, that a bipedal figure roughly her height and build was worth fearing. "If it's learned," Oswin had said, arms crossed, watching from the gallery threshold, "if the adults simply picked up some cue from station chatter, some pheromone we're not measuring that's specific to your species and has somehow already propagated through the habitat ventilation, the juvenile won't react. It's never been exposed to anything to learn from. And if it does react," Marn said, "despite having no possible source for learned behavior." Oswin did not answer that. He simply nodded once for the enclosure prep to continue. The juvenile was small, barely a third the mass of the adult coilcat from that morning, spotted coat still carrying the softer, less defined markings of an animal not yet a year old, and it bounded into the enclosure with the loose, curious energy of any young predator investigating new territory, sniffing at the climbing structures, batting at a hanging vine. Entirely unbothered by the observation gallery or the handlers or anything at all, until it rounded the base of the largest terraced rock formation, and its eyes landed on Naomi standing in the enclosure's center. The bounding stopped instantly. Every line of the animal's small body went taut. It did not charge, did not flee, did not do anything a juvenile predator with no learned threat response should have been capable of doing, because juveniles that young, Naomi understood from her own years of work with young cats back on Earth, generally lacked the neurological wiring for a fully formed threat assessment at all. They investigated, they played, they occasionally got themselves killed by things they hadn't yet learned to fear, because fear, in most young predators, was taught. Layered on top of instinct through experience and observation, and the slow, patient correction of a mother's discipline. This animal had had no mother's discipline on the subject. It had had no experience. It had had, as far as the directorate's meticulous records could establish, absolutely nothing to teach it what it was currently doing, which was backing away from Naomi Calder one slow, deliberate step at a time, tail tucked low, ears flat, uttering a soft, thin, distressed sound that Kess would later identify, checking the species' vocal catalog, as a cub's alarm call. The specific sound a coilcat kitten made when it believed, with total and unlearned conviction, that something in its territory was capable of killing it. Nobody in the gallery spoke for a long moment. "That's not a taught response," Kess said finally, quietly, mostly to himself. "That's not something it picked up from an adult, or a scent trail, or ventilation contamination, or anything else Counselor Oswin's models can explain, because there is nothing in that animal's 6 months of recorded existence for it to have learned this from. That is a 6-month-old kitten with no prior exposure to this species reacting to Ms. Calder exactly the way its parents did. Instantly. Instinctively." He looked up at the gallery glass, and this time when he found Naomi's face through the reflection, the expression on his broad, tusked features had settled into something Naomi hadn't seen from him yet across the whole strange day. Not surprise anymore, not disbelief. Something closer to recognition, the specific unhappy clarity of a man finally understanding a fact he wished he could go back to not knowing. "It isn't learned," he said. "Whatever this is, it's wired in. It's older than the animal's own memory." Counselor Bray Oswin stood at the gallery's edge for a long time after that, saying nothing, his small, deep-set eyes fixed on the juvenile coilcat now huddled at the enclosure's far wall, still making that thin, distressed sound. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the crisp bureaucratic confidence it had carried that morning. "Get her out of there," he said. "I've seen enough of the juvenile. I don't need to watch a kitten have a breakdown to make my point for me." He turned to Marn. "Director, I withdraw my objection to your preliminary classification revision. I want it on record, however, that I would like considerably more data before this goes to the full council, because I do not think either of us understands yet what we are looking at, and I would very much like to, before we tell every colonial safety board in coalition space to rewrite their containment protocols around one human woman and a jar of instant coffee." "Understood," Marn said. Her spiracles clicked, slow and even, and Naomi, watching from the enclosure floor as 2 handlers gently coaxed the still-trembling juvenile toward a transfer crate, offering it a soft cloth-wrapped bundle it immediately buried its face against, thought that the director's comm had cost her something to hold onto over the last several hours, and was holding on by threads that were fraying visibly, plate by plate, click by click. "Ms. Calder," Marn said over the comm, "you may exit through the service airlock. I believe we have exhausted the enclosures scheduled for today." "There's one more," Naomi said. A pause. "I beg your pardon." The catalog. Naomi had spent the last 2 hours in the commissary doing more than picking at scorched sugar protein. She'd pulled up the directorate's public threat index on her tablet and read through the species list twice, the way she used to read through a sanctuary's incident logs before a new animal arrived, because she had never once in her life walked into an enclosure without knowing exactly what she was walking into. "You've got a species logged as the largest confirmed apex predator in coalition records, Karagasti, the worm. It's flagged as the single most dangerous specimen currently held anywhere in the Directorate's habitat network. If you want data that Counselor Oswin can't argue with, that's the one that settles it." The silence on the line this time went on long enough that Naomi wondered if the comm bead had dropped the connection entirely. "Ms. Calder," Marn said finally, "the Karagasti specimen we hold is 9 meters from snout to tail, has a recorded bite force capable of shearing through a habitat-grade containment door, and has, in the 4 years since its transfer to this station, killed 1 handler through a containment breach and severely injured 2 others. It is not part of today's schedule. It was never going to be part of today's schedule. I would not have proposed testing it against an unarmed specimen of any species, let alone. I'm not asking you to propose it, Naomi said. I'm volunteering. There's a difference, and I think you know it. In the gallery, Ambassador Grady Voss set down the tablet he'd been holding with a hand that was, for the first time all day, visibly unsteady, and looked at Director Marn with an expression that carried 63 years of watching younger people insist on things he'd rather they didn't. Don't, he said quietly to no one in particular and to everyone in the room at once. Please, don't let her. Marn's clustered eyes moved from the ambassador to the enclosure floor below, where Naomi Calder stood, unarmed, entirely calm, waiting for an answer. Give me the room, Marn said. The gallery emptied in stages, Oswin first silent, his formal rap rustling. Then the junior researchers herded out by a gesture from Kess. Then more reluctantly, Ambassador Voss, who paused at the door long enough to catch Naomi's eye through the reinforced glass and hold up 2 fingers, a small private signal they'd worked out months ago during a tense trade negotiation that meant, roughly, 2 minutes and then I'm coming back and whether you like it or not. Naomi nodded. Voss left. That left Marn, Kess, and Naomi standing on opposite sides of the transparent alloy, and for a moment none of them spoke. I need you to understand something before I answer you, Marn said finally. This is not a question of whether I believe you would survive. I have watched 4 separate apex predators, 3 of them with no prior exposure to your species, and 1 of them an infant with no capacity for learned behavior, independently conclude in under 15 seconds that they were not equipped to challenge you. I no longer believe survival is the variable in question. What I do not know is what happens to an animal that has already killed a coalition handler through sheer aggression, that has no history of backing down from anything, when it is placed in a room with something its own instincts are screaming at it to submit to, and it has never, in its entire violent life, learned how. I do not know if that animal retreats. I do not know if it panics. And a cornered 9-meter apex predator that does not know how to retreat is not a data point, Ms. Calder. It is a catastrophe with a bite radius. That's a fair concern, Naomi said. Can I ask Warden Kess something? Marn's mandibles clicked in assent. You've worked predators for 19 years, Naomi said, looking at Kess through the glass. You've had that look on your face since the coilcat this morning, not surprised exactly, not anymore. Like you were waiting for something you already half expected. What is it you're not saying? Kess was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped the professional cadence he'd carried all day, settling into something rougher, more private. I had a cousin, he said, Tavrik. He handled predator units for the border service, out past the Kesh relay corridor, before your species had even been formally cataloged. This would have been almost 7 years ago now, right at the edge of first contact, back when nobody out there knew what a human even was. There was an incident. A supply skirmish, nothing planned, nothing anyone expected. A border patrol ran into an armed human vessel that had strayed past a boundary marker neither side understood yet, and shots were exchanged before anyone worked out it was a misunderstanding. Tavrik had a Threshkin sentry beast with him, a trained war predator, bred for exactly that kind of engagement, blooded in 3 prior actions. When the skirmish ended, when the humans had been talked down and the whole thing resolved into an apology and a diplomatic footnote nobody, outside the border service, ever heard about, Tavrik's Threshkin would not go anywhere near the human vessel's boarding party, would not approach, refused a direct handler command for the first time in its service record, and the Threshkin's whole reason for existing was following direct handler commands under fire. Kess's tusks shifted, a gesture Naomi had learned over the strange long day to read as the Tulkari equivalent of a grimace. Tavrik wrote it up as an anomaly. 1 incident, 1 animal, an unfamiliar species, nothing conclusive. It went into an obscure supplementary file nobody read, because nobody had a reason to connect one skittish war beast to anything larger. I read that file 2 years ago, when your species provisional catalog entry crossed my desk for review. I filed it away as an oddity too. He looked at Naomi through the glass, and this time there was nothing professional left in his expression at all. I have spent all day watching that oddity stop being an oddity, Ms. Calder, 4 separate times. Marne's spiracles worked, slow and audible even through the glass. Warden, you never logged this. There was nothing to log, Director. One anecdote from a border incident 7 years old, filtered through a cousin's memory, and a report I read once. It wasn't data. It was a story. Kess's voice roughened further. It's not just a story anymore. Silence stretched between the three of them, broken only by the low hum of the enclosure's environmental systems, and, distantly, the muffled sound of the Karagasti specimen shifting in its holding pen 2 corridors away. A deep, resonant scrape of something enormous moving across reinforced stone. If I do this, Naomi said finally, I want full containment protocol. Field engaged the entire time, not standby. I want 2 exits, not 1. I want Warden Kess at the primary control board himself, not a junior handler, because I trust the man who just told me that story more than I trust anyone else on this station to make the call to abort if something looks wrong before I'd know to ask for it. And I want it understood clearly by everyone in that gallery that if the containment field engages and that animal is still coming, I am allowed to leave, and nobody is going to ask me to stand my ground for the sake of a data point. This isn't about proving anything. If the pattern's real, it'll hold. If it doesn't hold, I'd rather find that out with 3 seconds to spare than none. Marne's mandibles clicked. Once, a sound that in 6 years of professional coalition service she had learned to make sound like agreement, even when it cost her something to give it. Warden Kess, she said, prep the Karagasti transfer. Full containment protocol, field active from the first second both service exits manned. And Warden, she paused. If you call the abort, nobody in that gallery questions it. Not the council liaison, not me. Your judgment on that floor is final. Kess nodded once and turned toward the corridor, and Naomi watched him go with the specific, focused stillness that had carried her through every enclosure since the Coilket that morning. Not fearlessness, exactly, because she was not, whatever the readouts might eventually claim, entirely without a pulse that quickened at the right moments. Just the old, well-worn discipline of someone who had learned a long time ago, watching a lioness named Kestrel decide every morning whether the day's human was worth trusting, that the animal in front of you could always read your fear before your mind had finished forming the word for it, and that the only honest gift you could give a predator standing on the other side of a very thin line was the truth of your own calm. Ambassador Voss found her in the corridor outside the Karagasti transfer bay 11 minutes later, and did not bother pretending his 2-minute deadline had meant anything. I could pull rank, he said. I could invoke the liaison override and tell Marne this is off the table. I've thought about it for the last 10 minutes, standing right here. You could, Naomi agreed. I'm not going to. I know. He looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of a man who had spent 30 years learning to read the difference between recklessness and conviction across a negotiating table, and had decided, a long time ago in some quiet private accounting she'd never fully see, that this was the second one. Your father would have hated this, he said finally. He'd have hated every second of it. My father raised me on nature documentaries, and told me the ocean was the only thing on earth that never lied to you about what it was, Naomi said. I think he'd have understood it better than you're giving him credit for. She looked past Voss, toward the reinforced doors at the corridor's end, behind which something 9 meters long was shifting its weight against stone with a sound like a slow avalanche. I'm not doing this to win an argument with a council liaison, Grady. I'm doing it because 4 different animals today looked at me and made a decision their entire evolutionary history should have made impossible, and I want to know why. That's not bravery. That's just the same question I've been asking my whole life, pointed at something bigger than usual. Voss didn't answer that. He only reached out briefly and squeezed her shoulder once, the way he had in the debrief room that morning, and stepped back to let her walk toward the transfer bay alone. The Karagasti enclosure had not been designed as a habitat so much as a fortress. Naomi understood that the moment the transfer bay's inner doors opened, and she stepped through into a cavern of gray reinforced stone 3 times the height of any enclosure she'd stood in that day, its walls scored with old claw marks that ran in parallel gouges from floor to a ceiling lost in shadow, its far end swallowed in a deep pool of black water that steamed faintly in the cold air. The containment field ran along the enclosure's perimeter as a faint blue shimmer at the edge of her vision, close enough to the ground that she could feel a low electric hum through the soles of her boots, and somewhere above her, through glass reinforced to a specification she did not want to know the number for, Director Marn, Counselor Oswin, and every off-duty researcher who had heard the word Karagasti spoken in a station corridor in the last 20 minutes stood pressed against the gallery rail. "Transfer gate opening in 10 seconds, Kess's voice said in her ear, steadier now than it had been in the corridor, the voice of a professional settling into the one part of the day that still made sense to him, the mechanics, the protocol, the numbers. "Field is active and confirmed at full strength. I have both service exits manned and the abort channel open on my board. Ms. Calder, I want you at the center marker, and I want you to understand that at any point in the next several minutes, if I say the word retreat, you move toward exit 2 without discussion. Not toward me, not toward the gallery. Exit 2. Confirm." "Confirmed," Naomi said, and walked to the faint painted circle at the cavern's center and stood there in her crooked patched field jacket, with her hands loose at her sides, and waited. The far wall of the cavern, beside the steaming black pool, had a gate set into it wide enough to drive a transport vehicle through, and when it began to rise, the grinding of its mechanism echoing off the scored stone, Naomi felt, for the first time all day, honestly, privately, in the small animal part of her mind that no amount of professional calm had ever fully quieted, something close to fear. It did not show. She had spent too many years learning not to let it show. The Karagasti came out of the darkness beyond the gate low and fast, and it was, even accounting for every briefing packet and every specification sheet she had read that morning, larger than she had let herself imagine. 9 meters of armored, sinuous bulk, moving on 6 clawed limbs with a speed that seemed to violate its own mass, a wedge-shaped head crowned with bony ridges parting in a jaw that unhinged wider than the transfer gate it had just come through, rows of teeth catching the cavern's dim light in a wet gleam. It had killed a coalition handler through a containment breach. It had injured 2 more. It moved into the cavern the way water moves downhill, inevitable, unhurried, entirely certain of its place at the top of every food chain it had ever encountered. For 3 full seconds, it did not seem to register her at all. It moved along the cavern's edge in a loose patrol, head swinging low, testing the air, and Naomi stood at the center marker and watched 9 meters of apex predator circle the periphery of her small blue-shimmering world and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that maybe this was the one. Maybe this was where the pattern broke, an animal too large, too dominant, too far past the reach of whatever instinct had folded 4 smaller predators into submission that day, to register a single unarmed human as anything but prey. Then the Karagasti turned its wedge-shaped head and looked directly at her, and stopped moving entirely. The silence that followed had a texture to it Naomi would try, later in the long debrief that followed, to describe to people who had not been standing in that cavern, and would never quite manage. It was not the frozen stillness of the coilcat, not the scrabbling retreat of the tunneler, not the collapsing coordination of the pack. It was something heavier, 9 meters of the most dangerous animal in Coalition catalog records going utterly, completely rigid, every claw braced against the stone floor as if bracing against a current only it could feel, its jaw slowly, deliberately closing, the wet gleam of its teeth disappearing behind lips that had never, in 4 years of recorded aggression, closed voluntarily around anything but a kill. Kess, Marn's voice said over the open channel, tight and controlled. Report. It's not attacking, Kess said. It's not retreating either, it's just... A long pause filled with the low hum of instruments Naomi couldn't see. Director, its heart rate has dropped by 40% in the last 8 seconds. Its threat response neural markers, everything we track for aggression escalation, they're not elevated. They're falling. It is not gearing up for a strike. It is doing the opposite of every documented behavior this species has ever displayed under any form of stress. The Karagasti's 6-clawed limbs shifted, slow, deliberate, lowering its enormous armored bulk toward the stone floor by degrees, the bony ridges along its skull tipping downward, and Naomi watched 9 meters of the single most dangerous animal the Coalition had ever catalogued fold itself, joint by joint, into the same low, flattened, deferential posture she had seen from a coilcat 11 meters away that morning. Except this animal did not stop there. It kept lowering itself, kept folding its great armored length down against the cold stone, until its wedge-shaped head came to rest flat against the floor, angled away from her. Its throat, the one part of its heavily armored body that carried no plating at all, soft and vulnerable and utterly exposed, turned toward the open cavern floor between them. Naomi had read enough behavioral literature across enough species, human and otherwise, to know exactly what she was looking at. It was not merely submission. It was the specific, deliberate posture of an animal offering its most vulnerable point to something it had already completely conceded authority to. The posture a wolf gives its alpha. The posture nothing in this animal's 4 years of recorded violence had ever, not once, been observed to give anyone. Kess. Naomi kept her voice level quiet, the voice she used to use crouched at the edge of Kestrel's enclosure at dawn. Talk to me. What's it doing? It's submitting, Kess said, and his voice had gone hoarse. Fully, throat-exposed submission, the posture our records show this species using exactly twice in 4 years, both times toward a rival male it had already lost a dominance fight to. It has never displayed this posture toward a handler. Not once. Not toward the specimen that killed one of my colleagues 18 months ago and very nearly killed me alongside him. A pause, long enough that Naomi could hear, faintly, something that might have been a breath being steadied on the other end of the line. It is showing you the posture of an animal that has already lost, Ms. Calder, and you haven't done anything. You are just standing there. I know, Naomi said. I'm not going to move closer. I don't think it wants that any more than I do. She stood at the center marker for what the transcript would later record as 4 minutes and 11 seconds, unarmed, entirely still, while the largest apex predator in the Coalition Ethology Directorate's entire catalog lay flattened against cold stone with its throat exposed and did not so much as twitch a claw, and in the gallery above. Director Ilvex Marn stood with every one of her spiracles clicked shut and watched the readouts on her tablet with the particular stillness of someone recording, in real time, the death of everything she had believed she understood about the shape of danger in the galaxy. Ms. Calder, Marn said finally, her voice carrying, for the first time all day, something that was not quite professional detachment. You may withdraw. We have what we need. Naomi took 3 slow steps backward, the way she had with the pack that afternoon, and the Karagasti did not lift its head, did not follow, did not so much as shift its enormous weight against the stone. It stayed exactly where it had folded itself, throat bared to an empty cavern, long after the transfer gate had risen behind Naomi and sealed her retreat into a corridor lit by cold blue emergency lighting. Long after the containment field had cycled down to standby, long after every instrument on Kess's board had confirmed that whatever had happened in that cavern was, by every measurable standard the Directorate possessed, over. It was Kess himself who met her at the transfer bay's inner door, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply looked at her. A small, unarmed, 30-year-old human woman in a field jacket with a crooked patch, breathing a little fast now that the discipline of the last 4 minutes had a moment to unclench, with the specific expression of a man who had spent 19 years believing he understood, in his bones, exactly what danger looked like, and had just watched that understanding come apart at the seams in front of him, for the 4th time in a single afternoon. "I don't have a category for what I just watched," he said finally. "I have spent my whole career learning the shape of fear in 100 different species, Ms. Calder, and I do not have a word in my own language for what that animal just showed you. We don't have a posture that low in our own threat taxonomy. We had to reach for the word from an old religious text to describe it, back in the debrief just now, before I came down here. One of the junior researchers said it looked like supplication, and nobody in that room corrected her. "It's not supposed to look like that," Naomi said quietly. "None of it is." "No," Kess agreed. "It isn't." Counselor Bray Oswin was waiting for her in the observation gallery when she came up from the transfer bay, and for the first time since she had met him that morning, he did not have the look of a man building an argument. He had the look of a man rebuilding one, from the ground, in real time, and finding the foundation gone. "I want to believe there is still a variable I haven't controlled for," he said, without preamble, as Naomi came through the gallery door. "Not because I doubt what I watched. Because my entire professional life has been built on the principle that fear is fear, that every predator species, however alien its biology, shares a common substrate of threat response that behaves according to rules we can model, rules a colonial safety board can build a containment protocol around. If what I watch today is simply fear, extraordinary fear, fear at a magnitude we've never documented, that is unsettling, but it is still fear, and fear is a category I know how to plan for. What I am afraid of, Ms. Calder, is that it isn't fear at all." "What would it be if not fear?" Naomi asked. "That is exactly what I would like to find out," Oswin said. "There is a specimen in this station's secondary habitat wing, a Uranic ashbourne, bred and conditioned for deep mantle mining operations on a volcanic world where the ambient hazard density would otherwise trigger a normal predator's threat response, so constantly, the animal would be useless for labor. 3 generations of selective breeding, supplemented by early conditioning protocols, have produced a specimen with what our own researchers class as a functionally blunted fear response. It will walk into open magma flow corridors, tolerate handling that would send any other apex predator into a killing rage, ignore stimuli that register as extreme threat on every instrument we have. It does not feel fear the way other predators do, Director Marn. Its fear circuitry has been bred nearly out of existence. If Ms. Calder's presence produces the same response in that animal that it has produced in 4 others today, then whatever we are measuring is not fear. It is something underneath fear, something the Ashbourne's breeding program never touched, because nobody building that program ever imagined they needed to." Marn's spiracles worked slow. "You want to test a fear-null specimen?" "I want," Oswin said, "to know what I am actually asking the entire coalition to rewrite its safety doctrine around, before I stand in front of the full council and tell them their models are obsolete." The Uranic ashbourne, when the transfer gate rose 40 minutes later, did not look like a predator at all in the way Naomi had come to expect from the day's parade of teeth and claws and armored bulk. It was smaller than the Karagasti, built low and broad, its hide a matte charcoal gray scored with pale heat cracks like old lava rock, and it moved into the small testing chamber with the flat, unhurried indifference of an animal that had, quite literally, been bred not to care what happened to it. Naomi had watched, on the monitor in the transfer corridor before she'd gone in, footage the handlers pulled up of the same specimen walking calmly through a live ignition test, flame washing across its hide, its vital signs barely registering the event at all. It crossed half the chamber toward her before it seemed to register her presence, nostrils flaring along a snout built low and wide, and Naomi watched its gait change, not stop, not freeze, not flee, because whatever machinery in a normal predator's mind produced those responses had been bred nearly out of this one, but slow, and shift, angling its heavy body a few careful degrees off a direct line toward her. Giving her birth the way a large vehicle gives birth to an obstacle it has no interest in testing. Vitals, Kes said over the comm, and Naomi could hear something almost like relief fighting with something else in his voice, the relief of a hypothesis holding and the dread of understanding exactly what that meant. Heart rate steady, no elevation consistent with its baseline conditioning. But look at the movement vector, Director. It's routing around her. That's not a fear response. There's no fear response left in that animal to trigger. That's something closer to. He stopped. Say it, Marn said. Deference, Kes said. Not fear. Recognition. Whatever this is, it isn't asking the animal's fear circuitry a question. It's answering a question that circuit was never built to ask in the first place. Something older. Something the breeding program never bothered to touch because nobody building an ore hauler thought they needed to strip out an instinct nobody knew was there. It is treating her the way a low-ranking animal treats something it has already, silently, without any fear at all, conceded ground to. Naomi stood very still in the center of the testing chamber and watched an animal bred across 3 generations to feel nothing at all give her the same wide, careful berth: a coilcat, a tunneler, a pack of 6 apex hunters, and the single most dangerous specimen in the Coalition's catalog had given her that same long day, and thought, with the small quiet clarity that had carried her through all of it, that Oswin had gotten his answer, and that it was very likely worse than the one he'd been hoping for. I have what I need, Oswin said over the comm in a voice that had gone entirely flat. Get her out. Director Marn, I am calling the full council session tonight. I want every safety board representative for every colonial charter within 40 light-years present, and I want them looking at this footage before they go to sleep, not after. The full council convened at Meridian Threshold Station 4 hours later, in a chamber Naomi had only ever seen empty during her 8 months on station. A wide amphitheater of tiered seating built to accommodate a dozen different species' preferred posture, some benches, some perches, some low padded wells for representatives who found sitting upright an unnatural strain. Tonight every tier was full. Delegates had arrived by shuttle from 3 neighboring systems in the 4 hours since Oswin's summons had gone out, a speed of assembly that Ambassador Voss, standing beside Naomi at the chamber's lower entrance, murmured was the fastest he had seen the Coalition's notoriously slow bureaucracy move in 2 years of watching it. They don't convene like this for trade disputes, he said quietly. They don't convene like this for border incidents. I've seen this chamber fill this fast exactly once before, and that was when a mining collapse on a Phelian verge trapped 40 workers under a kilometer of rock, and every colonial charter within range needed to coordinate a rescue in real time. He glanced sideways at her. This is what fast looks like, out here. This is what it looks like when everyone in the room understands all at once that something has changed, and they don't yet know how much. Director Marn presented first, standing at the chamber's central podium beneath a floating holographic display that cycled, in careful clinical sequence, through the day's footage, the coilcat freezing mid-stride, the tunnelers' aborted strike, the pack's collapsing coordination, the juvenile's unlearned terror, the Karagasti's bared throat against cold stone, the Ashbourne's careful, fearless detour. She spoke for 11 minutes without interruption, her voice carrying the flat, precise cadence of a scientist determined not to let a single word of speculation slip past a wall of pure documented data. And when she finished, the chamber held a silence that Naomi, sitting in the gallery beside Voss and Kes, 3 tiers back from the delegate's floor, could feel pressing against her skin like a physical weight. The first delegate to speak was an elderly representative of a species Naomi didn't recognize, small and quilled, seated in one of the padded wells near the chamber's edge, her translated voice carrying a slow, deliberate formality that suggested considerable age and considerable authority. "Director Marn," the delegate said, "I represent the Ilvina Colonial Trust. 11 years ago, before your species entered coalition space, we lost a survey team of 6 on the border moon of Kes Adjunct 4 to what our records list as an unidentified predator incursion. An animal none of our xenobiology teams had ever cataloged, that left no trace but partial recovered remains, and a set of sensor readings so anomalous the incident was eventually filed as equipment malfunction. Because the alternative reading was considered too implausible to submit to the record." Her quills shifted, a slow ripple of unease running the length of her small frame. "I would like the record to reflect, Director, that Kes Adjunct 4 sits 11 light-years from the human deep space relay array your survey vessel discovered 6 years ago. I do not know if there is a connection. I am not qualified to know, but I have carried that unresolved incident on my conscience for 11 years, Director, and I would like your directorate's opinion, now, on whether it is time I stopped assuming it was equipment malfunction." Naomi felt Voss go very still beside her. Marn's spiracles worked, slow, before she answered. "Delegate, I cannot speak to a specific unconfirmed incident from before formal contact. What I can tell you is that, as of this afternoon, this directorate has documentation, across 5 independent specimens spanning 4 distinct predator taxonomies and 2 entirely separate biological modalities of threat response, of an instantaneous, unlearned, apparently universal recognition of the human species as occupying a threat category no other species in our current catalog occupies. I would not presume to tell you what happened on Kes Adjunct 4 11 years ago. I would tell you that I no longer consider it implausible." A second delegate rose, a broad-shouldered representative in military dress that Naomi recognized, from Ambassador Voss's brief low-voiced identification, as an officer of the Coalition's Frontier Defense Corps, one of the few standing military bodies the loosely federated coalition maintained at all. And his voice, when it came through the translation feed, carried none of the careful diplomatic hedging of the delegate before him. "I have a simpler question," he said. "We have, across the frontier corridor, 41 active colonial charters bordering territory with confirmed apex predator populations. Every containment protocol on every one of those charters is built on threat response models. This directorate has just told us do not apply to at least one member species of this coalition. I'm not asking about 11-year-old cold cases, Director. I am asking what happens on any frontier world. Tomorrow, the next time a human settler walks within sensor range of an unclassified predator species nobody has thought to run this test against. Do we have any idea at all what we are looking at?" "No," Marn said simply, and the honesty of it landed in the chamber harder than any hedge could have. "We do not. That is precisely why this session was called." It was Counselor Asuin, rising from his seat near the chamber floor, who finally turned the room's attention toward Naomi. "I would like the human subject to speak," he said, "not as a formality. Because everyone in this chamber has spent the last hour discussing her as a phenomenon, a data point, a category to be classified, and she has spent the entire day standing 8 meters from animals that could have ended her in under a second, and I think this council owes her the courtesy of hearing what she has to say about it before we finish deciding what she is." Every tier of the chamber turned toward the gallery, dozens of eyes and eye clusters and sensory arrays Naomi couldn't begin to name, and she felt Voss's hand briefly touch her shoulder, not holding her back this time, just steadying, a small private gesture that said, "Whatever you need, I'm here," before she stood, and made her way down to the chamber floor alone. The podium had been built for the directorate's own scale, and Naomi had to stand slightly to one side of it to be seen over the top, which struck her, in the strange floating half-second before she spoke, as exactly the right amount of ridiculous for the moment. Dozens of alien faces watched her from the tiers above, some patient, some openly skeptical, some carrying the same rattled, unsettled qualities she'd watched grow across Director Marn's expression over the course of the day. And she thought of Kestrel, the old sanctuary lioness, and the way the animal used to watch her from the far side of the enclosure fence at dawn, deciding, and found, to her own mild surprise, that the nerves she'd half expected simply weren't there. "I'm not a xenobiologist," she began. "I want that on the record before anything else, because I think this council is at risk of treating me like an expert witness, and I'm not one. I ran a wildlife sanctuary. I fed big cats, treated their injuries, learned to read their moods from 20 meters away, and got bitten twice, both times because I got complacent, not because the animal was cruel. That's the whole of my expertise. So I can't tell you with any scientific authority why 5 different predator species today looked at me and decided, faster than thought, that I wasn't worth testing." She paused. Let the honesty of that sit in the chamber for a moment. "But I can tell you what I've spent my whole life learning to notice, because it's the same thing I noticed with Kestrel, the lioness I mentioned, on the very first morning I met her. Every predator I've ever stood near, hers, and yours, apparently, is running a constant, automatic calculation on everything that moves near it. How fast is it? How it holds its weight? Whether it startles, whether it flinches, whether its eyes move like something that's deciding whether to run or deciding whether to close the distance. Most prey species broadcast the first kind of signal without ever meaning to. It's not a choice. It's built into how a fleeing animal's whole body is put together, because for that animal, for 100 million years, hesitation was death." She looked around the chamber slowly, meeting as many of the alien gazes as she could hold at once. "Humans didn't get that history," she said. "Our world had predators of its own, worse than most of you would guess, honestly, for a species that likes to talk about how safe its home planet was. Big cats, pack hunters, things twice our size with better night vision and faster legs, going back long enough that our own bodies were shaped by every encounter we lost. And what got us through that, what got enough of our ancestors to the point where they could pass anything down to the next generation at all, wasn't running faster than the animal chasing them. It was very rarely running at all. It was standing in a clearing with a spear and a fire, and about 40 pounds less muscle than the thing across from you, and finding some way, through your eyes, your stillness, your refusal to flinch when every part of your body was screaming at you to convince that animal in the 2 or 3 seconds you had to do it, that closing the distance would cost it more than it was willing to pay. The ones who could do that reliably lived. The ones who couldn't, didn't get the chance to teach anyone else how. We've had, by some estimates, close to 2 million years to get very, very good at one specific thing, making a predator larger and faster than us reconsider." She let that settle. "I don't know if that's what your instruments measured today. I don't know if it's chemical or postural or something in the eyes, or all 3 at once, layered so deep in us that we don't even know we're doing it. I've been doing it my whole career, and I never once thought of it as a superpower. I thought of it as just paying attention, standing still, not being afraid, or at least not letting the fear get to my hands and my shoulders and my breathing before I had a chance to decide what to do with it." She paused. "Whatever it isn't something I turned on this morning. It's something that's been sitting in every one of us this whole time, and none of us knew, because until today nobody had ever bothered to check." The chamber held its silence for a long moment after she finished, the particular silence, Naomi thought, of a room full of people trying to decide whether what they just heard was reassuring or the opposite, and finding, somewhere in the middle of that decision, that it was both at once. It was the frontier defense officer who spoke first, his translated voice quieter now than it had been earlier. 2 million years, he said. And your species arrived in Coalition space 6 years ago carrying that, and never once mentioned it. We didn't know to mention it, Naomi said. Nobody had ever run this test on us before. As far as any human being alive knew this morning, we were exactly what your provisional catalog said we were, a mid-tier omnivore species that likes coffee and doesn't do well with sunburn. I found out what I apparently am at the same time you did. I'm not hiding a card here, officer. There wasn't a card to hide. There was just a question nobody had thought to ask. Counselor Asuin rose again from his place near the chamber floor, and when he spoke this time, his voice had settled into something that Naomi recognized, distantly, as the sound of a bureaucrat doing the hardest part of his job. The part where the honest answer wasn't the comfortable one. I came into this session intending to argue for a measured, incremental revision to the human threat classification entry, he said. A cautious upgrade, pending further data, the kind of careful institutional response this council is built to produce. I have changed my position over the course of this evening, and I want to be honest about why. It is not because I am certain of what we are dealing with. It is because I have watched 5 separate specimens, a solitary ambush predator, a blind subterranean hunter, a coordinated pack alpha with 11 years of killing experience, an infant incapable of learned behavior, and the single most dangerous apex predator in this directorate's entire catalog. Independently and instantly reach the same conclusion about one unarmed human standing in an enclosure. I have watched a fear-null specimen bred across 3 generations, specifically, to feel nothing reach that same conclusion through a channel that has nothing to do with fear at all. I do not think incremental is the correct word anymore for what this council needs to do. I think the correct word is honest, and the honest classification for this species, pending whatever further study this directorate deems necessary, is apex recognized, a category, as several of you will recall, that exists in our current framework for exactly one purpose. Species that every tested predator population instinctively defers to, regardless of relative size, armament, or numerical disadvantage. We have applied that classification 4 times in this coalition's recorded history, gentlemen and delegates, and on each of those 4 occasions, it was applied to a predator species we ourselves had cause to fear. He paused, and something in the careful bureaucratic evenness of his voice finally cracked, just slightly, into something more honest. I would like the record to reflect that this is the first time in this coalition's history that classification has been applied to a species that has never, in 6 years of contact, raised a weapon against any of us. The chamber held that for a long moment, and Naomi, standing alone at the podium built for a scale that wasn't hers, understood, with a clarity that settled into her chest like something cold and quiet and permanent, that she had walked into an enclosure that morning to be a control subject in an unremarkable afternoon, and was walking out of this chamber as something else entirely, not because she had done anything at all, but because, for the first time in the history of this small corner of the galaxy, something ancient and unspoken and entirely involuntary in the space behind her eyes had looked back at every predator that measured itself against her, and every single one of them had understood, in less time than it took to draw a breath, exactly what it was looking at. The vote, when it finally came near midnight station time, was not unanimous. A scattering of delegates abstained, citing insufficient data, procedural caution, the reasonable institutional instinct to not rewrite 6 years of settled doctrine on the strength of a single afternoon's footage. But it passed by a wide enough margin that Director Marne's office would spend the next 3 days processing the formal classification amendment. Through every layer of coalition bureaucracy, the vote had just set in motion. Humanity's provisional entry in the Directorate's threat calibration catalog, 4 lines long that morning and flagged insufficient sample, would be rewritten by the end of the week into 11 pages of careful, hedged, deeply unsettled clinical language. appended with a classification code that had been used in the entire recorded history of the coalition of bound worlds, exactly 4 times before, and never once for a species whose only recorded act of aggression toward another coalition member in 6 years of contact was a misunderstood border skirmish that had ended in an apology. Naomi left the podium before the formal vote concluded, at Marn's quiet suggestion, and found Kess waiting for her in the corridor outside the chamber, standing beneath a bank of the cold blue emergency lighting that seemed to run through every service corridor on the station, his broad tusked face unreadable in the dim glow. "I have a question," he said, "and I would understand if you didn't want to answer it tonight." "Go ahead." "That coilcat this morning, the adult, the first one," he hesitated. "It has not eaten since the test. The handlers reported it an hour ago. It's taken water, but it won't touch food, won't approach the enclosure's climbing structures, won't do anything but sit in the corner of its holding pen with its ears flat. I've seen predators go off their feed after a genuine trauma before, a lost fight, a failed hunt that nearly cost them their life. I have never seen it happen from an encounter where nothing touched them at all." His tusks shifted, that grimace equivalent she'd learned to read over the long day. "I don't know how to help it, Ms. Calder. 19 years handling that species, and I don't have a protocol for an animal that simply had its whole understanding of where it stands in the world taken away from it in 11 seconds. Naomi was quiet for a moment. "Can I see it?" "Now, if that's allowed." Kess studied her for a long moment, and whatever he found in her face, the same steady, focused calm she'd carried through every enclosure that day, none of it performed, none of it costing her anything she wasn't willing to spend, seemed to settle something in him. "Come with me," he said. The holding pen was small, dim, quiet, nothing like the elaborate jungle canopy enclosure the coilcat had spent the morning in, just a bare concrete cell with a raised sleeping shelf and a single low light. And the animal was exactly where Kess had described it, curled in the far corner with its spotted tail wrapped tight around its own body, ears flattened, eyes half-lidded and fixed on nothing. It did not react when the outer door slid open. It did not react when Naomi stepped, slowly, into the small viewing alcove separated from the pen itself by a single pane of reinforced glass. Not the full containment field this time, just glass, a formality more than a barrier, because nobody on the station believed anymore that this particular animal needed to be contained from anything. She crouched down slowly, bringing herself level with the coilcat's line of sight, the way she used to crouch outside Kestrel's enclosure at dawn, and said nothing at all for a long time, just let her own stillness sit in the small dim room the way she had let it sit in every enclosure that day. And after several minutes, long enough that Kess, watching from the doorway, had gone entirely silent himself, the coilcat's ears came up, just slightly, and its half-lidded eyes tracked toward her without lifting its head from the floor. "I'm not here to prove anything to you," Naomi said quietly, to an animal that had no capacity to understand a single word she was saying, and knew, with a certainty she couldn't have explained to Counselor Oswin or Director Marn or anyone else on the station, that the words themselves mattered less than the tone, the stillness, the low, unhurried register of a voice that wasn't asking anything of the animal at all. "You didn't do anything wrong today. You did exactly what every good instinct you have told you to do, and it was the right call, and I'm not going to come back in here and make you prove it again." The coilcat watched her for a long moment, and then slowly uncurled itself by a few careful degrees, enough that its tail loosened its tight wrap and its head lifted an inch off the concrete floor, and made a low, rough sound in its throat that Kess, checking his tablet with visible surprise, identified a moment later as a sound the species catalog had on file only twice. A contact call, the low chuffing noise a coilcat mother made to a kitten she was reassuring. Never before recorded, directed at anything but its own young. "That's new," Kess said very quietly. "Is it a bad sign?" "No," Kess's voice had gone rough again, the way it had in the corridor outside the Karagasti transfer bay that afternoon. "I don't think it's a bad sign at all, Ms. Calder. I think that animal spent 11 hours believing you were something it had no framework to survive encountering, and it has just spent 30 seconds in a room with you deciding, on its own, that whatever you are, you're not currently a threat to it. That's not fear anymore. I don't know what to call it. But I don't think it's fear." Naomi stayed crouched by the glass a while longer, watching the coilcat settle, its tail unwinding fully now, its ears no longer pinned flat against its skull, and thought about the word Kess had reached for and set down twice that day without quite being able to hold on to it, supplication. And now this, something adjacent to trust, offered by an animal with every biological reason not to offer it. To a species it had met for the first time 11 hours earlier, and had no possible framework for understanding beyond the one, single, overwhelming fact: its instincts had handed it in 11 seconds flat. She did not feel triumphant. She had not expected to, and the absence of it didn't surprise her. Mostly, crouched in the dim light of a small concrete cell with an animal 3 times her mass slowly deciding it was safe to breathe evenly again, she felt something closer to the quiet, careful responsibility she'd felt every morning of her 4 years at the sanctuary, crouched outside Kestrel's fence. The specific weight of being trusted, however briefly, however strangely, by something that had every capability in the world to decide otherwise. The weeks that followed moved faster than anything Naomi had experienced in 8 months of otherwise unhurried coalition bureaucracy. The formal classification amendment cleared the directorate's internal review in 4 days instead of the usual 4 months, fast-tracked by an oversight council that had, in Councillor Oswin's own dry phrasing during a follow-up briefing, developed a sudden and pronounced interest in moving quickly. Within a week, colonial safety boards across 9 systems had requested copies of the full test footage, and within 2, Meridian Threshold Station had received formal inquiries from 3 separate frontier charters asking, with varying degrees of diplomatic delicacy, whether the Directorate could arrange similar baseline testing against local predator populations they'd never been able to safely study up close. Ambassador Voss handled the first of those requests personally, standing in Director Marn's office with a copy of the inquiry on his tablet, and an expression Naomi had learned, over 8 months of watching him work, meant he was about to say something he'd already decided was non-negotiable. "The answer is no," he said, before Marn had finished reading the request aloud. "Not because I doubt the science. Because I've read this inquiry twice now, Director, and buried in the very polite, very careful diplomatic language is a request to use a human being as a piece of specialized equipment, send her out, stand her near the dangerous animal, record what happens, thank her for her service. That is not a role Ms. Calder signed up for, and it is not a role Earth's provisional government is going to authorize any human being to be volunteered into, however politely the request is phrased." "I would not have proposed authorizing it either," Marn said. "I raised the request because I believed you would want the opportunity to refuse it formally, on the record, before it became an assumption baked quietly into future planning. I have some experience, Ambassador, with how quickly a useful precedent becomes an unexamined expectation if nobody says no to it early and clearly." Naomi, sitting in the corner of the office with her own cooling cup of bitter tea, found she appreciated that more than she'd expected to, the small, unglamorous bureaucratic act of a coalition director closing a door before anyone had a chance to quietly prop it open. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'd have said no myself, not because I'm afraid of another enclosure, because I didn't do this so somebody could put me on a duty roster. I did it because I wanted to know what I was looking at, and now I do, and that's the part I actually care about, the answer, not a job description built out of it." "And the answer," Marn said, turning her clustered eyes toward her, "satisfies you?" Naomi considered that for a long moment. "Not completely. I think we found the edge of something, not the whole shape of it. I think there's a lot of work left figuring out what exactly the trigger is, whether it's universal across every predator taxonomy in coalition space, or whether we got lucky with a specific cluster of species, whether it's something that could ever be measured directly instead of just observed secondhand through an animal's behavior. I'd like to be part of that work. I just don't want to be the work myself. She looked at Marn steadily. There's a difference between a research partner and a specimen director. I think today was the last day anybody in this station gets to be confused about which one I am. Marn's mandibles clicked slow, something in the gesture that Naomi had come, over the intervening weeks, to read as closer to respect than the professional detachment it had carried that first morning. Understood, she said, and agreed. For what it is worth, Ms. Calder, I would like to extend a formal research fellowship. Not a testing assignment, a fellowship, co-authored, your name on the published findings alongside my own and Warden Kess's, to continue this work as a colleague rather than a subject. I suspect you are the only person on this station, human or otherwise, who understands both halves of the equation well enough to ask the right questions. It was Kess, 3 days later, who finally gave voice to the question that had been sitting, unspoken, at the edges of every conversation since the council vote. The question Naomi had noticed circling the station's corridors in the careful, sideways glances of researchers who had not been in the gallery that day, but had watched the footage since. The question that had, she suspected, traveled a great deal further than Meridian Threshold Station by now. They were standing at the edge of the SciFiNarration enclosure, the wide artificial step under its simulated sky, watching through the reinforced glass as Seer led her pack through an ordinary, unremarkable evening hunt drill against a mechanical lure. The pack coordinating, flanking, closing with the same fluid, practiced efficiency they'd shown that first day, before an unarmed human had stood in the middle of their territory and unmade in 4 seconds. Everything 11 years of hard experience had taught their alpha about her own authority. Do you ever think about what it would have meant, Kess said, if your species had arrived in coalition space under different circumstances, not through a survey vessel clipping a relay array by accident? If you'd arrived armed, angry, looking for something to take, every predator on this station folded in front of you today with no weapon in your hand at all. I try not to imagine what that instinct would have looked like pointed at us on purpose, and I find I can't quite stop imagining it anyway. Naomi watched Seer bring her pack around the mechanical lure in a clean, practiced arc, 6 animals moving as one coordinated whole, and thought about the question longer than she thought Kess expected her to. I think that's the wrong thing to be afraid of, she said finally. Not because it isn't possible, because it isn't what happened. We arrived scared and confused and completely unprepared, and the first thing my government did with the resources it had was send diplomats and researchers, not soldiers, send me to a wildlife post, because that's the skill set somebody thought might actually be useful, not a weapon because nobody back home was thinking about weapons at all. What today proved isn't that humans are dangerous, Warden. Every apex species in your catalog is dangerous by that same definition. That's what apex means. What it proved is that the instinct sitting underneath all 6 billion of us, whatever it turns out to be, has spent this whole encounter completely unused, because nobody's asked it to be anything but a wildlife biologist standing still in a room, not moving toward anything, not taking anything, just paying attention. She looked at him. I'd rather you be afraid of what we could do than certain of it. Certainty's the thing that gets people killed on both sides of a first contact. I'll take being watched carefully over being trusted blindly any day of the week. But I don't think you need to lie awake over what happens if we ever decide to use whatever this is on purpose. We've had it the whole time, and we haven't. Kess was quiet for a long moment, watching the pack finish its drill and scatter back across the dry grass toward the feeding station at the enclosure's edge. No, he agreed finally. You haven't. I suppose that's the part I keep coming back to, turning it over. A species that's had this since before it had fire and spent every year of its recorded history just not using it. I don't know what to do with that, Ms. Calder. I've spent 19 years learning that the most dangerous thing in any room is the animal that doesn't know its own strength. I am beginning to suspect the more dangerous thing, the thing nobody in this coalition has a taxonomy for yet, is the animal that knows exactly what it is and simply chooses every single day not to be that. The transmission came in 9 days after the council vote, routed through Marne's office with an urgency flag Naomi had not seen used before, and by the time she reached the directorate's operations floor, Kess and Marne were already bent over a projected display showing sensor footage from a frontier settlement called Renhalo Reach, a small farming charter on the outer edge of the same system as Kess Adjunct 4, the border moon the quilled delegate had spoken of that first council night. The one with the 11-year-old unresolved incident nobody had wanted to call anything but equipment malfunction. Perimeter sensor caught it 2 nights ago, Marne said without preamble, gesturing Naomi closer. A predator species local to that system's outer moons, never formally cataloged because the settlement's charter is barely 18 months old, and nobody's had the resources to run a full survey yet. It came within sensor range of the settlement's eastern boundary at full dark, moving with a hunting gait their perimeter AI flagged as active predatory approach. There was a person in its path. Her spiracles clicked tight. Watch. The footage was grainy, low-light, time-stamped in the corner in a species notation Naomi couldn't read, but the shapes were clear enough. A lean, long-limbed animal moving low through scrub brush toward a fence line, and on the other side of that fence line, close enough that the sensor's infrared caught the small, bright bloom of a human heat signature, a figure standing frozen at the edge of a maintenance shed. Not standing calm, not standing trained. Standing terrified, Naomi could see it even in the grainy footage. The particular stiff, locked stillness of someone paralyzed by fear rather than choosing composure. Someone who had simply frozen because their legs had stopped working. The oldest and least useful of all the body's responses to a predator closing distance in the dark. The animal closed to within 11 meters of the fence line and stopped. It did not charge. It did not test the fence the way a genuinely hunting predator would have, probing for a weak point, circling for an angle. It simply stood at 11 meters, its head low, and after nearly 90 seconds of stillness that felt, even second-hand through grainy sensor footage on a screen 9 days and several systems removed from the actual event, unbearably long, it turned and moved back into the scrub brush at a pace that was not quite a retreat and not quite indifference. Something in between, an animal that had come looking for something easy and found instead, something its instincts refused to let it approach. Despite every visible sign that the thing in question was doing nothing but standing there, rigid with fear it hadn't chosen and couldn't have hidden if it tried. Who was that? Naomi asked quietly, though some part of her had already guessed. A settlement worker, Marne said. 17 years old, human, no training in predator behavior of any kind, no combat experience, no specialized equipment. She was checking an irrigation valve after dark and did not see the animal until the perimeter alarm went off. Marne's clustered eyes settled on Naomi with an expression that carried, for the first time since Naomi had met her, something almost gentle underneath the clinical precision. I wanted you to see this footage specifically, Ms. Calder, because I know the shape of the question that has been sitting behind your eyes since the council session. You told the chamber that whatever this is, it comes from something you learned to hold on to, stillness, discipline, a lifetime of practice standing calm in front of something dangerous. I believed you. I still believe the practice sharpens it, but I wanted you to see a 17-year-old settlement worker with no training at all, frozen stiff with a fear she made no attempt to control, produce the same result in an animal she never even saw coming until it was already 11 meters away. She let that settle. It is not your skill, Ms. Calder. It was never only your skill. It is your species. Naomi watched the footage loop again, the animal's low stalking approach, the abrupt stop, the long 90-second stillness, the eventual retreat into darkness, and felt something in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite the cold dread Kess had described weeks before, but some third thing that didn't have a clean name, the particular, sobering weight of understanding that whatever strange gift or curse the day at Meridian Threshold Station had uncovered did not belong to her at all. It belonged to a scared teenager checking an irrigation valve in the dark on a border moon she'd probably never expected to hear discussed in a coalition council chamber. It belonged, apparently, to every human being who had ever stood their ground without entirely meaning to, going back further than any of them had records for. "I'd like a copy of that footage," she said finally. "Not for the directorate's files, for her. I think she should know what actually happened out there, instead of just being grateful the animal walked away. I think she deserves to understand what her own body did for her, even scared out of her mind." "I'll arrange it," Marn said. Kess, who had been silent through most of the exchange, spoke up from where he stood at the edge of the display, his broad, tusked face unreadable in the low light of the operations floor. "There's a second piece of the footage," he said. "The settlement's outer log." We pulled the archive going back to the charter's founding, looking for any prior encounters with the same predator population, and found something the initial survey missed because nobody was looking for it. He gestured, and the display shifted to an older recording, timestamped some 14 months earlier. The same fence line, the same species, this time approaching not a frozen teenager but an empty stretch of perimeter, and this time not stopping at 11 meters at all. The animal in the older footage crossed the fence line entirely, breached a supply shed, and made off with a full case of stored provisions before the settlement's automated defenses even fully activated. 14 months ago, Kess said quietly, before there was a human standing anywhere near that fence line, that same predator population treated this settlement's perimeter as an open larder. 2 nights ago, with nothing standing between it and an unguarded shed but one terrified 17-year-old with no weapon and no training, it turned around and walked away. He looked at Naomi, and something in his expression had settled over the last 9 days into a kind of quiet, sober acceptance that Naomi found, strangely, more unsettling than his earlier disbelief had ever been. "I don't think this coalition fully understands yet what it means that 41 frontier charters have been building their perimeter defenses around every threat variable, except the one that turns out to matter most. I think we are going to spend the next several years finding out." Earth's response, when it finally arrived through the slow, multiply-relayed diplomatic channel that connected the provisional human government to its distant embassy at Meridian Threshold Station, took the better part of a week to compose. Not because nobody back home had an opinion, Ambassador Voss told her wryly, but because apparently everybody did, and reconciling several dozen competing opinions into a single official diplomatic response was, as always, the slowest part of any government's job. "They're not panicking," Voss said, reading through the response in his office with Naomi seated across from him, a fresh pot of actual coffee, a rare luxury on station, brewed from a bag he kept locked in a drawer for occasions he judged worth it, steaming between them. "I want you to know that first because I know you've been bracing for something worse. Mostly they're doing what governments do with information this strange, forming committees. There's already a working group being assembled to study the implications for Earth's own domestic wildlife management, if you can believe that apparently somebody in the Agriculture Ministry immediately wanted to know whether this changes anything about how we handle wolf reintroduction programs back home, which I found almost funny, given everything." He set the tablet down. "But there's a section here I think you should read yourself." He turned the screen toward her. It was a short passage, buried in the middle of several pages of careful diplomatic language, attributed to an elderly wildlife biologist from a research institute in the hill country not far from where Naomi had spent 4 years running her sanctuary. A man she recognized by name, though she'd never met him. One of the field's quiet, respected elders, the kind of person whose papers you cited without ever expecting to correspond with him directly. We have spent the whole of our recorded history believing ourselves the reason nature needed protecting from us. The passage read, "Every apex predator on our own world learned to fear us the hard way, through generations of hard, brutal contact, guns and traps, and the steady contraction of their territory into whatever scraps we left them. We told ourselves that fear was taught, earned through violence, and in some ways it was. What this discovery suggests is that something else was happening underneath all of that the entire time, that the fear we thought we built through force may simply have been our own predators finally getting close enough to notice what had apparently been true of us since long before we ever picked up a spear. I do not know what to do with that information any more than the coalition does. But I find, examining my own long career watching animals decide, moment by moment, whether a given human being was worth fearing, that I am not surprised. I think some part of every field biologist who has ever stood quietly at the edge of a predator's territory and watched it choose not to test us has always known this, without ever having the instruments to prove it. Naomi read it twice and found, somewhere in the second read, that her throat had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something older and harder to name. The specific, private ache of finding a stranger's words describe, with more precision than she'd managed herself in front of a full coalition council, exactly what she'd spent her whole career quietly, half-consciously believing. "I'd like to write him," she said finally. "When things settle down, I don't even know what I'd say yet. But I'd like to." "I think he'd like that," Voss said. "For what it's worth, I sent him a private note myself before the official response even finished drafting, told him what I watched you do in that cavern with the Karagasti." He was quiet for a moment, turning his own cooling cup of coffee in his hands. "You asked me that day outside the transfer bay what what your father would have made of all this." He caught himself, a small, rueful smile. "I've been thinking about it since. I never met the man, but I've read enough of what you told me about him, over 8 months of long shifts and longer diplomatic dinners, to have a guess. I think he'd have said the ocean never lied to you about what it was, and he'd have been glad in the end that it took the rest of the galaxy this long to work out what we are, because it meant we'd had 2 million years to decide, mostly on our own, without anyone watching, what we were going to do with it." Naomi didn't answer that right away. She sat with her coffee cooling in her hands, looking out the narrow observation window of Voss's office at the slow wheel of stars beyond the station's hull, and thought about Kestrel, and the coilcat curled in its small concrete cell learning, in 30 strange seconds, to trust something it had every instinct to fear, and a 17-year-old girl frozen stiff at a fence line on a border moon she'd probably never wanted to be famous for, and a species-wide inheritance none of them had asked for, and all of them, apparently, had been quietly carrying the whole time. "I think he'd have liked the coilcat story best," she said finally. "He always did prefer the animals to the diplomacy." Voss laughed, quiet and genuine, the first real laugh she'd heard from him since the whole strange affair had begun, and for a moment the office felt, despite everything, almost ordinary, 2 colleagues drinking bad good coffee at the end of a long, strange week, the kind of moment that made the rest of it, the council chamber and the classification amendment and the grainy sensor footage from a border moon, feel briefly survivable in a way it hadn't quite felt before. It did not last long. Nothing on Meridian Threshold Station in the weeks that followed seemed to last long before the next request arrived, the next inquiry, the next colonial charter wanting copies of the footage, the next quietly nervous species representative requesting a private audience with the directorate to ask, carefully, diplomatically, whether their own historical incidents with humans, a border skirmish here, an unexplained retreat of local wildlife there. A strange, unresolved footnote in a survey report nobody had thought worth pursuing deserved a second look in light of what Meridian Threshold Station had documented. Director Marn fielded most of those requests personally, her spiracles working through longer and longer days with a patience Naomi found herself admiring more with each week that passed. And it was Marn, 3 weeks after the council vote, who called Naomi into her office one quiet evening with a request that felt, after everything that had come before it, almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. "I have one more test I would like to propose," Marn said. "Not for the catalog, for me." "What kind of test?" Naomi asked. "A quiet one," Marn said. "No council session, no gallery full of delegates, no footage destined for 40 colonial charters. Just you, myself, Warden Kess, and one specimen, a young Osri stalker, gentle disposition as these things go, no prior incidents on its record, nothing dangerous about the proposal at all. I want to ask you to do something none of the previous tests asked of you." She paused, her spiracles working slow. "I want to ask you to try to hide it." Naomi considered that. "You want to know if it's controllable?" "I want to know," Marn said, "whether what we have documented is a fixed biological signal, unconditional and involuntary, the way a scent marker is fixed regardless of an animal's intent, or whether it is something closer to a behavior, something that can be modulated, masked, turned down, even if it cannot be entirely switched off. The distinction matters more than you may realize, Ms. Calder. A fixed signal is a fact about your species that every other species in this coalition will simply have to build around, the way we build around gravity. A modulated signal is something else. It is a choice. And choices are the one thing this coalition's Oversight Council has spent 3 weeks quietly, anxiously, without quite saying so out loud, hoping very much that your species turns out to have. The Osri stalker enclosure was smaller than any of the day's original test sites had been, a modest habitat of low rock formations and shallow pools built for a species Naomi hadn't yet encountered. And when the transfer gate rose, the animal that emerged was almost gentle in its bearing compared to everything that had come before, slender, quick, covered in fine iridescent scales that shifted color with its mood. Its temperament rated in the directorate's files as skittish but rarely aggressive, prone to curiosity rather than confrontation. "I'd like you to try something specific," Marn said over the comm, once Naomi had taken her position near the enclosure's center. "Soften your posture. Avoid direct eye contact deliberately, the way a nervous prey animal might. Let your breathing run a little faster than it needs to. Let your weight settle unevenly rather than balanced. I am not asking you to fake fear you don't feel. I am asking you to actively, consciously project the opposite of whatever you've been doing in every prior test, and see whether the specimen's response changes." Naomi exhaled once and tried. It felt, she would tell Kess afterward, deeply strange, like trying to unlearn a language she hadn't known she was fluent in, hunching her shoulders slightly, dropping her gaze to somewhere just short of the animal's eyes, letting her hands drift instead of resting loose and still at her sides. The Osri stalker, drawn by curiosity rather than the low, wary caution its cousins across the day's earlier tests had shown, approached in a series of quick bird-like steps, its scales flushing a pale, curious blue, and closed to within 3 meters, closer than any of the day's original specimens had come voluntarily, before its own steps slowed, and its scales flickered, uncertain, from blue toward a duller, watchful gray. It stopped there, 2 meters further than the coilcat had let it get that first morning. But it stopped, its small head tilting, its posture shifting from open curiosity toward the same wary caution Naomi remembered from every prior enclosure, despite everything she'd tried to project in the other direction. "Interesting," Marn said quietly, more to herself than to the comm. "Warden Kess, what does the neural monitor show?" "Elevated," Kess said. "Not the flatline drop we saw from the Karagasti. This one's stress markers actually spiked briefly when she approached genuine confusion, I'd guess, the animal's instincts giving it two contradictory signals at once. The posture said prey, or at least said nothing to fear. Something else didn't say that at all, and it couldn't quite reconcile the two. He was quiet for a moment. It stopped at 3 meters instead of 8. That's a real difference, Director. That's not nothing. Marne's spiracles worked, slow and thoughtful. So it is not purely fixed, she said. It can be muted, softened, made ambiguous enough to draw a curious animal closer than it would otherwise come, but it cannot be erased. Even actively suppressed, even contradicted by every conscious signal Ms. Calder could layer on top of it. Something underneath still read clearly enough to stop the approach short of contact. That tracks with everything else today, Naomi said, straightening back into her ordinary stance, feeling something in her own shoulders loosen with something like relief at not having to hold the strange, unfamiliar posture any longer. It's not a costume I put on. It's not something I do. It's just there. I can turn the volume down, apparently. I can't turn it off. No, Marne agreed. It appears you cannot. She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something Naomi hadn't heard from the director before. Not the clinical precision of the morning's first debrief, not the careful diplomatic caution of the council chamber, but something quieter, more personal, the voice of someone setting down a question she'd been carrying, unspoken, since the very first frozen coilcat. That is, I think, the answer the council was hoping for, Ms. Calder, whether or not any of them would have admitted it aloud. A species that carries something this powerful involuntarily, unable to fully suppress it even when consciously trying, and has spent its brief 6 years among us using none of it, hiding none of it, weaponizing none of it, simply living alongside the rest of us as though it were an ordinary, unremarkable species with nothing at all to prove. Her clustered eyes settled on Naomi, steady. I do not think this coalition fully understands yet what it has been sharing space with. I am not certain I do either, and I have spent 3 weeks with nothing else to think about. But I find at the end of it that I am no longer afraid of the answer. I am simply grateful, Ms. Calder, that the species carrying it turned out to be the kind that sends its representatives to run wildlife sanctuaries instead of armies. The Osri stalker, still hovering at 3 meters with its scales cycling slowly from gray back toward a wary blue, chose that moment to turn and pick its way back toward the shallow pools at the enclosure's edge, unhurried, uncommitted, neither fleeing nor approaching. The first animal, Naomi realized watching it go, that had left the test without fully deciding anything about her at all, and found, strangely, that she was glad of it. Not every question needed a clean answer. Some things, apparently, even instinct itself preferred to leave open. Not everyone in coalition space took the news as calmly as Director Marne had. Naomi learned that in blunt, uncomfortable terms 11 days after the suppression test, when Ambassador Voss called her into an emergency briefing with a face she hadn't seen him wear since her very first week on station. The tight, careful stillness of a diplomat bracing for a conversation he already knew he couldn't fully control. "There's a delegation inbound from the Threshkin Compact," he said, without preamble. "Military adjacent, not civilian, a defense coalition that runs security contracts for 11 frontier charters along the Corward border. They've read Marne's preliminary findings, and they are not asking for a research fellowship. They're proposing what their transmission calls a precautionary containment framework for all human personnel operating beyond Earth's home system, movement restrictions near sensitive installations, mandatory disclosure of location for any human traveling within a defense corridor, a formal review of whether human diplomatic staff should be permitted unescorted access to coalition military assets at all." His jaw was tight. "They're not calling you a weapon outright. But they're treating the whole species like unexploded ordnance, and I need you in that room when they arrive, because I think they need to look a human being in the eye while they explain that policy, not just read a report about one." The Threshkin delegation arrived 2 days later, 5 armored officers in the dense, functional dress of a species built for cold environments, moving through Meridian Threshold Station's corridors with the clipped, economical bearing of people accustomed to command. Their lead negotiator, a broad-shouldered officer named Van Ithrel, insisted, more precisely, on meeting Naomi in a secure conference room rather than the Directorate's usual briefing space, and made no particular effort when she arrived to soften the blunt, wary appraisal in his gaze. "I want to be direct with you, Ms. Calder," Ithrel said, once the formalities had been dispensed with. "I do not doubt Director Marne's data. I have reviewed the footage personally, more than once. What I doubt is the wisdom of an interstellar coalition allowing an unmonitored, unregulated capability of this magnitude to move freely through our most sensitive installations simply because, so far, your species has chosen not to use it for anything. Intentions change, Ms. Calder. Governments change. I have built a career on the principle that you plan for capability, not promises, and what this directorate has documented is a capability that could, in the wrong hands or the wrong decade, unravel every defense architecture my compact has spent 2 centuries building." "That's a fair principle," Naomi said. "I've spent enough time around this station's protocols to respect it. But I want to ask you something, Officer Ithrel, and I want you to actually think about the answer instead of giving me the rehearsed one. In 4 months of testing, across nearly 50 specimens, in front of a full coalition council, under direct observation by this directorate's most rigorous instruments, what did any of us actually do? Not what were we capable of triggering in an animal's nervous system without meaning to. What did a human being on purpose, with intent, actually do to threaten anyone in this room?" Ithrel was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he admitted. "That is, in fact, precisely what makes this harder to plan for, not easier. A weapon, I understand. A weapon has a trigger, a range, a doctrine for use and restraint. What you're describing is a capability with no trigger at all, something that simply exists, involuntarily, regardless of intent, which means it cannot be reasoned with the way a chain of command can be reasoned with. I do not fear what your government might order you to do, Miss Calder. I fear what your species simply is, independent of any order at all, and I have no framework for negotiating with a fact of biology." "Then negotiate with the humans standing in front of you instead of the biology underneath them," Naomi said. "I understand the impulse to want a lever to pull, a policy that makes the uncertainty go away. But every restriction your proposal puts in place treats every human being who ever sets foot in coalition space as a contingency to be managed rather than a person to be dealt with honestly. You have 6 years of behavior to judge us by. Judge us by that, the way you judge any other species. Not by the worst thing an instinct we didn't choose might theoretically make possible, if every single person carrying it decided, all at once, to abandon everything they've done so far to prove otherwise." It was Director Marne, seated at the far end of the table with her spiracles working in the slow, deliberate rhythm Naomi had come to recognize as the Charon equivalent of choosing words with great care, who finally spoke into the silence that followed. "Officer Ithrel," Marne said, "I would remind you that this directorate's entire mandate exists to prevent exactly the kind of policy your compact is proposing, reactive, fear-driven restriction built on capability rather than conduct. We did not restrict the Karagasti species from continued study because it is capable of killing a handler. We built better containment protocols, informed by rigorous data, and continued working with the species on its own terms. I would ask your compact to extend humanity the same discipline you extend every other entry in this directorate's catalog, rather than a bespoke fear reserved only for the one species that happens to have alarmed us the most." The negotiation ran 3 more days, through channels considerably less visible to Naomi than that first tense conference room conversation, and ended in the end, Not with the sweeping containment framework the Threshkin Compact had arrived proposing, but with a far narrower agreement: enhanced monitoring protocols for human personnel at a small number of the Compact's most sensitive installations, reviewed annually, paired with an unusual clause Ambassador Voss had fought for personally. A standing invitation for Compact researchers to participate directly in the Directorate's ongoing study, rather than simply receiving its conclusions second-hand. "They'll come around slower than the rest of the coalition," Voss told her afterward in the quiet of his office, looking older than she remembered him looking 8 months earlier. "Some of them may never fully come around. That's the cost of what happened in that first enclosure, Naomi. Not that anyone thinks you're dangerous on purpose. It's that fear doesn't need intent to take root. It just needs uncertainty and enough time to sit with it." He rubbed a hand across his face, tired. "I don't regret letting you do any of it. I want you to know that. But I won't pretend the rest of this is going to be easy or fast or fair. Some of it's going to be neither, for a long time." "I know," Naomi said. "I think I knew that the day the coilcat froze. I just didn't have the shape of it yet." She looked out the narrow window at the slow wheel of stars, steady and indifferent, the same stars that had turned the same way through a council vote and a suppression test and a hawkish delegation's wary retreat, and found, underneath the tiredness, something that still resembled the same quiet resolve that had carried her into that first enclosure 8 months earlier. "We'll earn it the same way we always have, slowly, one room at a time. It's not a bad way to earn something, Grady. It's just a long one." 4 months later, Naomi stood in the observation gallery of the same enclosure where the whole strange affair had begun, watching a new intake specimen, a young Vashta coilcat, transferred in from a breeding program on a neighboring world, unrelated to the original animal, whose 11 seconds of frozen stillness had rewritten a coalition-wide safety doctrine, pace the warm volcanic stone below with the restless energy of an animal still adjusting to unfamiliar territory. The Directorate's threat calibration catalog now carried humanity's entry at 11 careful, heavily cited pages, cross-referenced against 43 additional specimens tested in the months since the original 5, drawn from research stations across 6 systems. Each new result folded into a growing body of data that had, if anything, only deepened the original mystery rather than resolving it. Nobody had yet identified a precise mechanism, chemical, postural, some combination neither the Directorate's instruments nor Earth's own contributed research teams could fully isolate. But the pattern itself had held, specimen after specimen, world after world, with a consistency that had, in scientific terms, stopped being remarkable and started being simply, quietly, permanently true. She was not alone in the gallery. Beside her stood a young man named Des Acaffer, 23, freshly arrived from Earth 3 weeks earlier as the Directorate's newest human research liaison, nervous in the particular way of someone who has read every briefing document twice and still doesn't quite believe the thing he's about to be part of. And Naomi found herself watching him watch the pacing coilcat below, remembering with an odd fondness her own first morning in this same gallery, the crooked patch on her jacket, the bitter tea. The small electric certainty that something ordinary was about to become something else entirely. "You don't have to go in today," she told him. "Marn scheduled your baseline for next week. There's no reason to rush it." "I know," Des said. "I just wanted to see one first, before it's me down there." "Fair enough." Naomi watched the young coilcat pause at the base of the climbing structure, testing the air, restless and unbothered by anything in its new enclosure yet. "For what it's worth, and I know everybody's told you this a dozen times since you signed on, you don't need to do anything different down there. Don't perform calm. Don't try to hold yourself some particular way because you think that's what worked for me. It isn't a technique. I spent 4 years at a sanctuary learning to be still around big cats, and that made it easier for me to hold my nerve. But the coilcat that first morning wasn't reading my training. It was reading something underneath the training that I didn't put there and can't take credit for." "You've got the same thing," Everyone does. Just don't get in its way by panicking on top of it. Des was quiet for a moment, watching the animal below settle into a patch of warm stone, tail curling loosely around its own paws. "Does it ever stop being strange?" he asked. "Knowing you're carrying something like that, something nobody asked you to carry that you can't put down." Naomi considered the question longer than she'd expected to, watching the coilcat below drift into an unbothered doze in the amber light of its new habitat. 4 months and a whole reshaped coalition doctrine, removed from the frozen, rigid animal that had started all of this. "No," she said finally, "it doesn't stop being strange. I don't think it's supposed to. But I've stopped thinking of it as something I'm carrying, exactly. It's more like finding out the ocean you grew up swimming in was always deeper than you thought. The water doesn't change just because you finally measured the bottom. You just swim a little more carefully, and you stop being surprised when something down there notices you're there." She glanced at him, and something in her own steadiness, earned the long, hard, ordinary way over years of quiet mornings at a fence line half a galaxy away, seemed to settle something in his shoulders too, the way it had settled things in a great many rooms over the last 4 months without her ever quite meaning it to. "You'll be fine down there next week, Des. Not because you're special, because you're human." That's apparently been enough this whole time. Below them, the young coilcat shifted in its sleep, one ear flicking toward a sound neither of them could hear, and settled again, unbothered, into the warm amber stillness of an enclosure that had, in 4 short months, become just another ordinary habitat on an ordinary research station. Its extraordinary history folded quietly into the Directorate's growing archive, alongside 400 other specimens worth of careful, patient, endlessly revised understanding of what danger actually looked like, once you finally knew where to check for it. Des's baseline ran the following week, and Naomi kept her promise not to hover, watching from the gallery beside Director Marn rather than standing anywhere near the enclosure floor herself, because she had learned, somewhere in the last 4 months, that the data mattered more when it wasn't tangled up with her own presence complicating the read. The specimen selected was a mid-tier ambush predator, nothing on the scale of a Karagasti, chosen deliberately for a first-time subject's sake, and Des walked into the enclosure with his shoulders set in the particular stiff, deliberate posture of a young man trying very hard to look calmer than he felt. It didn't matter. The animal froze at 9 meters, ears flattening, weight settling low against the stone in the same unmistakable posture Naomi had watched a dozen times now across a dozen different species, and held there, rigid and wary, refusing to close another centimeter of the distance between itself and a nervous 23-year-old who had never once, in his life, stood this close to anything more dangerous than a startled dog. Des's own heart rate, visible on the monitor beside Marn's console, was elevated, unsteady, nothing like the deliberate calm Naomi had trained herself into over years at the sanctuary fence line, and it made no difference at all to the animal watching him. "There," Marn said quietly, watching the readout settle. "That is, I think, the cleanest confirmation this directorate is likely to get, not a specialist, not someone with a decade of practice stillness behind her, an ordinary young man, visibly afraid, walking into a room for the first time, and the result holds exactly the same." Her spiracles worked slow. "It was never you, Ms. Calder. I do not believe I fully let myself accept that until this exact moment." "I told you that back in the first week," Naomi said, watching Des straighten from his cautious stance below, some of the tension easing out of his shoulders as the animal's stillness told him, in the only language it had, that whatever he'd been afraid of doing wrong, he hadn't. "You did," Marn agreed. "I believed you." "Belief and certainty are not always the same instrument, Ms. Calder. I think I needed to watch it happen to someone who wasn't you before the second one finally caught up with the first." She took her first leave back to Earth 2 weeks after that conversation, a short furlough granted more or less over her own mild objections, by an ambassador Voss, who had, in his own words, watched her run 4 straight months without a single day off, and decided the fellowship could survive her absence better than her nervous system could survive skipping it any longer. The transit took the better part of 9 days each way, cramped and uneventful, and she spent most of it reading through the Directorate's newest batch of specimen data rather than sleeping, which she suspected was exactly the habit Voss had been trying to interrupt in the first place. The sanctuary looked smaller than she remembered, the way places from a former life always did. The hill country dusked the same rust-orange it had always been under a sun that felt, after 8 months of a research station's carefully calibrated artificial lighting, almost aggressively warm on her skin. Her old colleague Priya met her at the gate with the particular expression of someone who had watched the footage from Meridian Threshold Station roughly 40 times, and still hadn't fully worked out how to look at the person in it. "You're famous," Priya said by way of greeting. "You know that, right? There was a segment about you on the evening broadcast. They interviewed your old university advisor. He called you unassuming, which I told him was an understatement, and he laughed and said that was rather the point." "I've been trying not to watch the broadcasts," Naomi admitted. "Feels strange, watching people talk about you like you're a phenomenon instead of a person who forgot to buy groceries for 6 weeks straight because she kept getting called into council sessions." "Come see her," Priya said, not needing to specify who, and led her across the familiar dry grass toward the old enclosure at the sanctuary's far edge, where a lioness well past the age most of her wild cousins ever reached lay stretched in a patch of afternoon shade, ears flicking lazily at the drone of insects, her golden coat gone paler with age around the muzzle. Kestrel did not get up when Naomi crouched at the fence line, the way she hadn't gotten up for anyone in the better part of a year now, arthritis and old age slowing a body that had once, 20 years earlier, been capable of closing 30 meters of open ground in under 3 seconds. But her eyes opened, found Naomi's face across the familiar distance, and held there, not with the wary, testing regard of that very first morning 2 decades ago, but with the loose, unbothered recognition of something long since decided and never once revisited. "She still does that," Priya said quietly. "Every time I try to introduce a new volunteer near her enclosure, she barely looks up. You crouch down there and she's watching you inside of 2 seconds, every single time like you never left." Naomi stayed at the fence for a long while, the late sun warm on her shoulders, listening to the ordinary hum of a wildlife sanctuary going about its ordinary afternoon, feeding schedules, visitor chatter from the far side of the grounds, a hawk circling somewhere overhead, and thought about the strange, improbable distance between this quiet, dusty enclosure and a cold, blue-lit cavern 9 light-years and 1 violent gate opening away, where the largest apex predator in an entire interstellar catalog had once bared its throat to her in total, wordless surrender. She thought about how the two things were not, in the end, as far apart as they might have seemed to anyone watching from the outside, that whatever instinct had made a 9-meter Karagasti fold itself flat against cold stone was the very same quiet, unglamorous thing that had, 20 years earlier, made a scarred, wary young lioness decide, over the course of 1 patient dusty afternoon, that the small human crouched outside her fence line was worth trusting. "She knew before I did," Naomi said finally, mostly to herself. "All of them did. I was just the last one to find out what she already understood." Priya didn't ask her to explain that. She simply crouched down beside her at the fence, and the two of them stayed there a while longer, watching an old lioness doze in the warm afternoon light of a world neither of them had ever needed a coalition catalog to understand, until the sun began sliding low enough toward the hills that the sanctuary's evening feeding bell rang out across the grounds, and it was time, at last, to go back inside. She made one more stop before the transit window closed, driving 3 hours north through hill country gone gold, with the last of the dry season to a small research campus. She'd cited in her own university papers a dozen times without ever once expecting to visit in person. The elderly biologist whose words Voss had shown her weeks earlier turned out to be smaller than she'd pictured, stooped and soft-spoken, with the particular weathered patience of a man who had spent 60 years watching animals decide things about him from a respectful distance, and had long since stopped needing anyone's permission to be right. "I didn't expect a visit," he said, waving her into a cluttered office lined floor to ceiling with field notebooks, some of them older than she was. "I assumed the letter would be the whole of it. People are usually too busy for the follow-through." "I wanted to see your notes," Naomi admitted, "the ones behind that paragraph. I've spent 4 months watching this from the alien side of the glass, Director Marn's instruments, the Coalition's careful language. I wanted to know what it looked like from someone who spent a whole career on our side of it, watching the same thing happen in slow motion over decades instead of one impossible afternoon." He was quiet for a while, paging through one of the older notebooks without quite looking for anything specific in it, the unhurried motion of a man revisiting old ground out of habit rather than need. "I spent 11 years tracking a leopard population that had every documented reason to see me as prey," he said finally. "Smaller than them, slower, worse eyesight, worse hearing, no claws worth mentioning. By every honest measure of the numbers, I should have been the easiest meal in that valley. I was never once tested. Not once, in 11 years, did an animal that could have ended me in 4 seconds ever commit to finding out whether it could. I told myself for a long time it was luck, or reputation, word passed some way between animals that I wasn't worth the trouble. I stopped believing that around year 7, when I met a leopard that had never encountered a human being in its life, orphaned young, raised entirely apart from its own kind by a rescue program before release. It looked at me across 20 meters on the day of its release, the very first human it had ever seen, and it sat down. Just like your coilcat did, from what I've read. Just like your Karagasti." He closed the notebook gently. "I didn't have the instruments to prove what I was watching. I only had 30 years of noticing it happen the same way, over and over, and no vocabulary that didn't sound like arrogance if I said it out loud to anyone outside this office. It's a strange kind of relief, Ms. Calder, having someone else finally build the machine that says you weren't imagining it." Naomi stayed most of the afternoon, reading through decades of careful, patient field notes that had never once used the word threat but had circled it, again and again, in 100 quieter phrasings. Animal declined to close distance. Subject showed no aggression response despite proximity, behavior inconsistent with documented predation pattern, and left as the light went gold over the hill country outside his window, with the particular settled feeling of having found the last piece of a puzzle she hadn't fully realized she was still assembling. She returned to Meridian Threshold Station on a transport that arrived, fittingly, at the tail end of the station's long artificial night cycle, and found Director Marn still at her desk despite the hour, surrounded by the particular controlled clutter of someone finalizing a document she had clearly been drafting, redrafting, and quietly agonizing over for weeks. "You're up late," Naomi said, setting her travel bag down inside the office door. "I am finishing the archive submission," Marn said, without looking up from the display. "The full, formal, permanent record of this directorate's findings, to be filed alongside the original classification amendment for any researcher in Coalition space to reference going forward. I wanted to have it drafted before you returned. I find I would rather you read it before I submit it, in case there is anything in it you believe I have gotten wrong." She turned the display toward Naomi, and Naomi read through it slowly, standing in the doorway with her travel bag still over one shoulder, pages of careful, precise clinical language describing 5 original specimens and 43 subsequent ones, describing an involuntary, unlearned, apparently universal threat recognition response documented across every predator taxonomy tested to date, describing a species 6 years into coalition contact that had, by every available measure, chosen not to weaponize an advantage that could plausibly have reshaped the balance of frontier security across a dozen systems, describing, in the dry, measured prose of an official coalition record, something that read, underneath all its careful hedging, very much like awe. Near the very end, in a section labeled Summary Assessment, a single paragraph had been set apart from the rest. This directorate's original mandate, the paragraph read, was to measure danger, to catalog which species posed a threat to which others, and to build from that catalog the safety architecture an interstellar coalition requires to function without constant, catastrophic misunderstanding. In 6 years of documenting the human species, this directorate found nothing in its behavior, its history, or its stated intentions to suggest it required a threat classification at all. It required one anyway, not because of anything the species did, but because of what every tested predator population, across every world and every biological modality this directorate has access to, instantly and involuntarily understood about it on contact. A recognition that owed nothing to human intention, nothing to human aggression, nothing to anything humanity had chosen to display. This directorate submits, with the full weight of its available evidence, that the correct lesson of the past 4 months is not that humanity is dangerous. It is that danger, as this coalition has always measured it, was never really about intention at all. It was always, underneath every doctrine we ever built, a question instinct answers before reason gets a vote, and every instinct we have tested across every species we could reach has answered the same way instantly, without hesitation, and without ever once being wrong. Naomi read it twice, and set the tablet down gently on the edge of Marn's desk. "It's good," she said quietly. "It's honest. I don't think I'd change anything." "I am glad," Marn said, and her spiracles worked in that slow, familiar rhythm Naomi had learned, over 4 months, to read as something close to genuine relief. "I have submitted a great many reports to the Coalition Archive over the course of my career, Ms. Calder. I do not believe I have ever submitted one I was afraid to be right about." Warden Kess found her in the corridor outside the office a short while later, still carrying her travel bag, and fell into step beside her without needing to be asked, the way he'd taken to doing over the last several months whenever the day's work finally ran down into something quieter. "How's the coil cat?" she asked. "The first one, I never did stop thinking about her." "Eating well," Kess said, "sleeping through the night. She's taken to a new handler on the morning shift, a young woman fresh off the transport from the compact, of all places, spent most of her career on the other side of that hawkish little delegation, and decided halfway through their negotiation that she'd rather work with the specimens than argue about them. The coil cat likes her fine. Doesn't flatten her ears anymore when anyone comes near the enclosure at all, not just you. I think whatever she carried out of that first morning, she's mostly set it down." He glanced sideways at Naomi, his broad, tusked face carrying an expression she'd come to know well over the months, equal parts dry humor and old professional wonder that had never quite worn off. "I don't know that I have, if I'm honest. 19 years handling that species, and I still catch myself some mornings standing at the enclosure glass just to watch her breathe easy. I don't think I'll ever fully stop being surprised that it turned out this gently, Ms. Calder. I spent the whole first day braced for something considerably worse." "So did I," Naomi admitted. "I think that's the part nobody back home really understands yet, reading Marn's report from a comfortable distance. It could have gone worse in 100 small ways, none of them anyone's fault. An animal that panicked instead of froze, a council that voted the other direction, a delegation that didn't stop at monitoring protocols." She shifted her travel bag on her shoulder, tired in the particular, settled way of someone who has finally stopped bracing for the next reversal. I think we got lucky, underneath all the science. Lucky that the instinct turned out to read calm instead of provoke chaos. Lucky that enough people on both sides were willing to sit in a room and be honest about what scared them instead of acting on it first. Luck, Kess said, and about 2 million years of practice, by your own account. He stopped at the junction where their paths would part, hers toward the transit berth to drop off her bag, his back toward the habitat wing and the long night's round still ahead of him. For what it's worth, Ms. Calder, and I don't say this often, so take it as it's meant, I'm glad it was you standing in that first enclosure, and not someone who needed to prove something by it. I don't think this station would have survived the last 4 months half as gently if it had been anyone else. High praise from a man who spends his days with things that could take my arm off, Naomi said. The highest I've got, Kess said, and there was real warmth under the gravel of his voice. Go get some sleep. You've earned an uneventful morning, if this station's ever going to hand you one. Outside the office's narrow observation window, the slow wheel of stars turned on, indifferent, the same stars that had turned the same slow way on the morning 8 months earlier when Naomi Calder had walked into an enclosure expecting nothing more than an unremarkable afternoon of baseline data collection, and had instead spent 11 seconds discovering something that no instrument on the station, no scientist in the gallery, and no human being on Earth had ever thought to look for, because nobody, in the whole long history of two species meeting each other for the first time, had ever bothered to ask a simple, obvious question. What does it look like? To something that has spent its whole existence deciding what danger is, when danger finally walks into the room without meaning to, wearing nothing but an ordinary face and an unhurried, unbothered calm, and never once has to raise its voice to be understood. Marne submitted the report to the Coalition archive that same night, and it was logged, cross-referenced, and filed, and became, within the year, the single most cited document in the Directorate's threat calibration catalog's entire history, required reading, eventually, for every new researcher, every colonial safety officer, every frontier handler who signed on to work anywhere within 100 light-years of human territory. Naomi never read the full citation record herself. She was, by then, 3 systems away, standing quietly in a small, dim observation gallery beside a nervous new liaison on his first morning, watching an animal that had never once in its life encountered a human decide, in less time than it took to draw a single breath, exactly what it was looking at, and finding, as she always did, that the only thing left to say about it was the same flat, quiet, unremarkable sentence she had given Director Marne on that very first afternoon. The sentence that had, somewhere in the retelling, become the closest thing the whole strange affair ever had to an official motto, stamped in dry clinical shorthand at the header of every subsequent report the Directorate ever filed on the subject. Subject uninjured, subject calm, no threat displayed. None was needed.